Hey there friends, David, Lightbringer here. Have you ever wanted somebody to make a YouTube video with all the known information about every single dragon mentioned in all of A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, good news. Welcome to the Encyclopedia Draconica, where you will find all the available information on every dragon mentioned in the entire series, from mythical dragons of the Dawn Age and Age of Heroes, to the dragons of the Valyrian Freehold, to the dragons of the Targaryen Conquerors, and of course, the many later Targaryen dragons involved in the Dance of the Dragons, most of whom, sadly, killed each other. We've got all of their physical descriptions, all of their riders, all of their great deeds of destruction, and any random trivia or other information I know about where their names came from or other cool things that they did. Now, I did make a video 3 years ago to rank all of the dragons involved in the Dance of the Dragons according to their size and level of experience at the time of the war. But today we are going to go deeper, and I'm going to tell you everything about every dragon. That means this will be spoilers all, so heads up. And I'll be honest, one of the reasons why I wanted to come back and make a video about all the dragons is because there really has just been a lot of incredible dragon artwork produced by the various artists of the fandom over the last 3 years, which I thought it would be cool to appreciate and celebrate together. So thanks to our many human dragon artists, the artists are humans. They're drawing dragons. They're not lizard people. The Targaryens are lizard people, but our artists are human, never AI. They're not robots. That's what I can tell you. And you'll notice I always put the name of the artist below the artwork when I'm showing it off, both because, you know, that's how you see it in an art gallery, but more importantly, so that you can look up the artist and support them online, which I very much encourage you to do. And just to give you the order on this, you can see this in the chapter dividers below in the YouTube play bar. But first we will do the mythical dragons, then the Valyrian historical dragons, then the Conqueror's 3 dragons, then we will do the Targaryen Golden Era dragons, so Dreamfyre, Vermithor, Silverwing, Caraxes, etc. Then we'll talk about the wild Dragonstone dragons from the dance, then the younger dragons of the dance, then the toddler dragons, the ones that never grew up to be very big, and then finally Dany's 3 dragons. So with that said, please do make sure that you are still subscribed to the channel, because YouTube has been unsubscribing people for whatever reason. I keep getting people telling me, yeah, look, I went and checked and YouTube unsubscribed, just like this candle got unsubscribed. See? Anyway, click the buttons and we'll get this started. All right, let's get this started. Thank you very much, by the way, for clicking on my video. I am the stoned dragon who is awake. I've pried my eyes open with a lot of caffeine. And so let's talk about the mythical dragons of the Dawn Age and Age of Heroes. Beginning with the one dragon who has no fire, for sure, the Ice Dragon. Perhaps the most mythical of A Song of Ice and Fire dragons, the Ice Dragons are said to exist in the Shivering Sea and the White Waste, which is basically the northern polar region, the ice cap. A Song of Ice and Fire ice dragons supposedly are essentially like dragon others. They are made of living ice, and their eyes are pale blue ice crystal. Their wings are translucent and very large. They are said to be far larger than the Valyrian dragons. And basically all of this information tracks exactly with the ice dragons from George Martin's short story, The Ice Dragon. If you haven't read that, give it a read. It's very cool. And although George says it is not canon it doesn't take place in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, it reads a lot like one of Old Nan's stories about the Ice Dragon that Jon and Bran speak of her having told them. So in the Ice Dragon is 3 times larger than the Fire Dragons and is basically an equal match for 3 of the Fire Dragons. And there's a cute little girl named Adara who's basically like a 9-year-old Night's Queen, and she rides the Ice Dragon. It's very cool. And so the big question is, are there really Ice Dragons in Ice and Fire? Is this just a legend that he put in his world as an ode to the Ice Dragon from his short story, or will we see one emerging from the lands of always winter at some point? Let me know what you think in the comments if we're going to see an ice dragon or not before the series is finished, which it's going to be. Next mythical dragon, Nagga. Nagga, the greatest sea dragon who fed on krakens and leviathans, which means giant squid and very large whales like sperm whales or even blue whales. Now, one thing that I will tell you, and that you will probably already be familiar with if you watch this channel, Nagga's ribs are not the ribs of a giant sea monster, but rather the weirwood ribbing of an ancient boat that the Grey King was said to have made from Ig, the pale demon tree who feeds on human flesh. That's a weirwood. Check out my recent What's Under Winterfell video, actually, for an explanation of the Grey King. Don't even ask, just watch the video. But the point is, Grey King said to have made a boat out of weirwood. There it is, flipped over and made into a long haul in the Viking style. And of course, the Ironborn, heavily inspired by Norse Vikings. And Vikings, in turn, they had a habit of carving the mastheads of their ships into dragon heads. And so the Grey King's weirwood boat may have been a sea dragon in the sense that it was a dragon ship. Real sea dragons may still exist, though. There's really no reason why they shouldn't. If we've got fireworms and wyverns and dragons filling out different ecological niches in different parts of the world, there's no reason why some of them shouldn't have gone swimming. The Maesters do consider it to be at least possible, although they mention that all the sightings of sea dragons are essentially ancient and legendary. But one thing that makes me think sea dragons may exist is simply the mythology that all this is based on. A lot of mythological dragons are tied to the water. Think of Jormungandr, the world serpent. And specifically Naggas, those are snake people, most often in I guess you'd say Southeast Asian mythology from India and China and places like that. The Naggas have become pretty widespread, but they basically are snake people tied to bodies of water, usually rivers. So a great name for a sea dragon. And yeah, again, I will say, let me know in the comments if you think the sea dragons are out there somewhere, perhaps off of Sea Dragon Point. All right, next up we have Urrax, and this is the dragon slain by the legendary hero of the Reach, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. This is labeled as an Age of Heroes myth, even though Serwyn is said to be a Kingsguard, at least nowadays, so this myth has obviously mutated a bit over time. And when we look at the name Urrax, it sounds a lot like the Valyrian and Targaryen dragons, such as Terrax, Arrax, Syrax, or Vermax. So this may be an older dragon slayer myth that's gotten a makeover over the years. And essentially, according to the story, Urrax was a dragon approached by Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, who used his mirror shield, kind of like Perseus approaching the Medusa, to distract Urrax. He hid behind the shield. Urrax was entranced by his own appearance, and then Serwyn rose up from behind the shield and threw his spear and stuck Urrax through the eye. Fatality, game over. And so essentially what we know about Urrax is that he was a very vain dragon. Reminds me a bit of my parrot, entranced by his own appearance in the mirror, which makes me wonder if Urrax said, "Hi, buddy," right before he died. Good boy. Who's that in the mirror? Hey guys, quick post-production edit here to talk about George's inspiration for the name Urrax. I'll be punching in a couple of times with some explanations for dragon names that I forgot to put in the original script. Since Urrax is the oldest dragon name that we have in the story, I was wondering if perhaps this might be a reference to the sky god Uranos or Oranos, the primordial, meaning first, deity of the Greek pantheon who spawned the first generation of gods with Gaia. The Greek prefix means first or original, while the suffix ax means body, as in thorax. So Urrax could mean first body, the first embodied dragon. The other possible reference is a little, I don't know if George is thinking about this, but the ancient Sumerian city of both because it's one of the oldest human cities, one of the first human cities, and because was dedicated to the Sumerian moon goddess Nana. As in old Nana, right? No, Nana's a moon goddess, and of course the moon is the biggest mirror that anyone has ever seen. And Urrax's story, I do think there is some mythical astronomy, and Serwyn's mirror shield is playing the role of the moon, with Urrax being the comet crashing into the moon. So perhaps Nana, the moon goddess, old Nana, Nana, hey Urrax, goodbye. All right, final mythical dragons, the dragons of the Great Empire of the Dawn. These would be the dragons from ancient Ashai that seem to probably have existed even before Valyria. And we do know pretty much for a fact, the Maesters seem to think, that dragons existed before Valyria ever arose. Dragon bones have been found all around the world, from Ib to Sothorios to Westeros. And then there are all those Westerosi ancient legends of dragon slayers, which theoretically come from there having been dragons in Westeros. And of course, the hardest evidence for ancient pre-Valyrian dragon lords are two different constructions built out of fused stone, which, so far as we know, can only be made with dragonfire and sorcery. And one of those things is in Westeros, the fused stone fortress that is beneath all iterations of the Hightower. And supposedly, the first Hightowers had to slay the dragons that were roosting on the walls of the Fused Stone Fortress when they first got there. And although that myth may be stylized a bit, it does make sense there would have to be dragons at the Fused Stone Fortress to make the Fused Stone Fortress. So check out my Origins of Old Town video for the full deep dive. The Hightowers may be descended from those dragon lords. Actually, them and the Danes. And another way that we could talk about these ancient dragons from Asshai is just to say Azor Ahai's dragon. There's a lot of clues that he was a dragon rider. I don't even know where to start with that, really. But yeah, that's what we're talking about. Ancient Asshai dragon lords. These dragons would probably be much the same as the Valyrian dragons, certainly equal to, maybe even greater than, if you want to go there, who knows. But the whole point is that if you think dragons have been engineered from fireworms and wyverns, it would have been these ancient Asshai who did that. And probably the Valyrians come from Asshai. The ancient Asshai would be the common ancestor between the Valyrians and the Danes. That's another way to say it. Now, do make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because after the House of the Dragon season, I'm going to come out with another giant documentary video, The True History of Valyria. And I'll go into pretty much all this stuff in more detail. Alright, so the Valyrian Freehold obviously is known for being a Dragon Lord civilization, but we actually don't get a lot of specific information about the Valyrian dragons. We know the Valyrians used their dragons to make all their incredible Valyrian roads and all of their cities and the Black Walls of Volantis and the Old Bridge of Volantis, which, by the way, a lot of the tremendous fan art of the bridge doesn't actually portray it as being fused stone because it wasn't on the show, but technically this bridge is made of fused stone, as well as dragonstone and Tyrosh, and well, you get the idea. And of course, all this fused stone stuff is George's fantasy version, kind of Roman concrete. And that's why the Valyrian roads, the Roman roads, and of course there are a lot of parallels between the Roman Empire and the Freehold of Valyria. As to the question of how many Valyrian dragons may have been alive at one time, we know the number is at least 300, because in the final war with the Rhoynar, the Valyrians brought 300 dragons to the battlefield and destroyed their army utterly outside of Volantis. So they've got at least that many at that point in time. And that is kind of the other thing the Valyrians are famous for using their dragons for: subject, conquest, and enslavement of anybody who's in their way. Starting with the Empire of Old Gis, which the Valyrians destroyed utterly. Burnt their pyramids, sowed the fields with salt, and they picked up the very nasty habit of enslaving people from the Giscari as well. And so yes, they proceeded to depopulate Essos, feeding people into their slave mines. You know how it goes. Another interesting thing about the Valyrian dragons, it's implied that they bred them for different purposes. We know that power was divided amongst the 40 families, and it doesn't seem like the Targaryens had access to Valyrian steelmaking or glass candles or dragon horns, because they didn't bring any of that stuff to Dragonstone when they left. And yeah, there's this line about the Targaryen dragons having been bred for war, which makes you think that perhaps they bred dragons for different purposes. For example, your road crew dragon, you wouldn't want Balerion the Dread. He's a little aggressive. He might eat the construction workers. You'd want a large dragon with very hot fire, but one that's used to being around people and perhaps a little docile, so very well fed and well kept, just working with the road crew team mile after mile. And then you might have your messenger dragons, your quick ones. They don't weigh too much. They can fly for a long time and get from place to place very quickly, etc., etc. Racing dragons, little purse dragons with fancy head crests and things like that. Check out the video Dragon Breeds for that whole theory. So the only named Valyrian dragon that we have is Terrax. And this is the dragon that the Dragon Lord Jennara Bellaris flew to explore Sothorios for 3 whole years, which is crazy. She apparently did not reach the end of Sothorios in all that time. Although if you check out my Sothorios video, I did cook up a little theory about what she may have been up to, so check that out. But yeah, I'm thinking Terrax must have been a pretty fierce dragon to have survived and protected Jennara in Sothorios for 3 years. So definitely a fearsome dragon. And the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki suggests that the name Terrax may be a reference to the Marvel Comics villain, which means yes, it probably is. George loves Marvel Comics. A villain named Terrax the Tamer, who is an enemy of the Fantastic Four. Now, I would suggest that the name Terrax is probably based on the Latin prefix terra, which means earth, since Terrax explored a good portion of the earth that no one else had ever seen before. And actually, both these answers are right, because the Marvel Comics people are aware that Terra means Earth, because Terrax the Tamer is a galactic herald, and he actually works for somebody named Galactus. He is the galactic herald in charge of Earth. And in one story, Terrax the Tamer threatens the Earth, and then Galactus shows up and strips him of his powers, because he was a very naughty boy. And so, of course, this is just a great example of how older Marvel comics, at least, are well steeped in classic world folklore. So that's pretty cool. Terrax in Genera Bellaris. Next, we have another specific Valyrian dragon, although we don't know the name. This would be Aurion's dragon. And Aurion, of course, he is one of the few dragon lords who was not home when the Doom happened. And so the histories of Qohor, which was at that time a Valyrian colony, say that Aurion, the dragon lord, flew his unnamed dragon there and raised a host of 30,000 men. Then he declared himself the first, and turns out last, emperor of Valyria, and marched his army and flew his dragon into doomed Valyria, never to be seen again. So that's a pretty cool story. Shout out to Aurion. And I do think, as I have said many times, that this is foreshadowing for Euron. Euron, who I believe will fly north of the wall on a dragon, probably Viserion, never to be seen again, perhaps accompanied by an army. That's all Euron Night King stuff. We can't get into that, but yeah. Euron, I think he's going to declare himself something like Emperor of Westeros, God King of Westeros, or something grandiose like that. All right, so final Valyrian dragon, another specific dragon, but without a name. This is Chai Duq's Valyrian wife's dragon. And Chai Duq, he was the fourth Yellow Emperor who took to wife a noblewoman of Valyria and kept a dragon at his court. So first of all, that's just cool. And this makes sense because, of course, dragons are very prominent in Chinese and broader East Asian folklore. So it is appropriate that we get at least one dragon at the court in Yi Ti. And this may also be a Great Empire of the Dawn clue, just something to get us to think about dragons this far east, because Yi Ti plus dragons essentially is the Great Empire of the Dawn. Yi Ti very much considers themselves to be the cultural heirs of the Great Empire of the Dawn legacy. And then more specifically, my friend Grey Waist Tim tells me that the idea of a Yellow Emperor who kept a dragon at his court is a very specific reference to one of the 4 King in Yellow stories written by Robert Chambers, which is called In the Court of the Dragon. So King in Yellow, in the Court of the Dragon, Yellow Emperor kept a dragon at his court. And this story, In the Court of the Dragon, it climaxes with an apocalyptic vision that reminds us a lot of Euron, and specifically the nightmares that Euron stuck into Aeron Damphair's head when he was hopped up on Shade of the Evening. And so the protagonist of the story experiences this vision of black stars and a moon rising behind Carcosa, and then there's the sudden appearance of the King in Yellow himself, whose presence is so overwhelming it basically envelops the characters in flame. And then the King in Yellow does a twisted quoting of scripture and says, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God." And so again, this is a lot like Euron casting off his mortal appearance and declaring himself a god to Euron. And so basically, again, if you've ever heard Grey Waist Tim talk about the King in Yellow, you will know that Euron is the primary avatar for George's King in Yellow inspiration. And so there you go. That's why Chai Duq, the Yellow Emperor, has a dragon at his court. All right, let us now speak of the great and terrible deeds of the Conqueror's dragons, and also those other 4 dragons that Aenar brought with him from Valyria, besides Balerion the Black Dread, whom we'll talk about in a minute, and whom was about 2 or 3 years old when the Targaryens moved to Dragonstone. So those 4 other dragons were presumably older and larger, and there's actually a little bit of a mystery here, potentially. None of those 4 dragons survived by the time of the conquest, which was about 112 years later. And so what happened to them? Did all 4 die of old age during that century? Were the pre-conquest Targaryens of Dragonstone involved in some wars where they lost a dragon or 2? Was there even a little internecine warfare where a couple of the dragons killed each other, a mini dance? Or was it the Cannibal? Was it the Cannibal, who we know we'll talk about the Cannibal, don't worry. The Cannibal, we know, likes to feast on the young hatchlings and the dragon eggs of the Targaryen dragon hatcheries on Dragonstone, and it's a bit of a mystery how long the Cannibal has been on Dragonstone. Some of the small folk do say that he predates the conquest and even the Targaryen arrival on Dragonstone. And so maybe the Cannibal killed all those dragons, or maybe there were other dragons besides the Cannibal. There's a big hole in the history here, is what I'm saying. So eventually maybe George will get around to garnering in this missing century. But yeah, these other 4 dragons, none of them survived, with Meraxes and Vhagar having been born on Dragonstone after they moved there. We have no real idea who would have ridden these dragons. Obviously, Aenar could have ridden one of them, but he's not specifically said to be a dragon rider. It just says that the Targaryens moved to Dragonstone with their 5 dragons. And certainly, this cool fan art does depict Aenar as a dragon lord. And so then here is the family tree from Aenar to Aegon. So presumably, it was some of these people riding those other dragons. And it's even possible that some of these people may have ridden Meraxes or Vhagar before Visenya or Rhaenys, because as we're about to discuss, those 2 dragons had been around for a few decades by the time that Rhaenys and Visenya claimed them. And it's also very possible that someone may have claimed and ridden Balerion the Black Dread between Daenys the Dreamer and Aegon the Conqueror, because we're not told of any riders during that time. All right, so let's give some respect to Balerion the Black Dread. He was the winner of our favorite dragon tournament live stream, as chosen by you, the live chat, a few months back. Check that one out. It was pretty fun and also quite heartbreaking to pit the dragons against each other, but that's kind of what happens in the Dance of the Dragons. And Balerion, he was one of those dragons that was named after a Valyrian god, a god of old Valyria. And as I will discuss on the True History of Valyria video, I suspect that the Valyrian gods may have been dragons anyway. And so saying the dragons are named after the gods, I think it's just a Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man thing. So punching in with an obvious oopsie here, Balerion's name pretty clearly inspired by the Balrog from Lord of the Rings. I don't think this even needs a ton of explanation. If you remember from the movies, if you've seen any of the Balrog artwork, you can definitely see the likeness to Balerion the Black Dread. Tolkien's Balrog, or Balrog, is very clearly a reference to Gaelic folklore and Balor of the Evil Eye. And George is, in turn, doing a lot with Balor of the Evil Eye folklore, with Baelor the Blessed and Bael the Bard and Peter Baelish and the Night King. And I actually went into that recently on an episode of Westeros Talk regarding Andal symbolism, which you can check out in the live stream tab of the YouTube channel. And so the known riders of Balerion the Black Dread were, of course, Daenys the Dreamer, King Aegon the Conqueror, King Maegor the Cruel, Aerea Targaryen, and finally King Viserys I. And again, maybe some other Targaryens between Daenys and Aegon back on Dragonstone. Now, one of the most interesting bits of dragon lore that we've learned since the publishing of A Dance with Dragons comes to us from a Valyrian prop book that was made for House of the Dragon. It's got a passage about the Doom, and in it we learn that Daenys the Dreamer had her famous dream of the Doom the night that she claimed Balerion, who was at that time no bigger than a horse, meaning about the same size as Drogon in A Dance with Dragons, and thus about 2 to 3 years old. That means that Balerion was born in either 111 or 112 BC, which means that he was either 205 years old or 206 years old when he died in 94 AC. Supposedly from old age, and perhaps not being helped by being confined in the dragon pit in the last decades of his life. It is hard to say, but it does seem that dragons can die from old age. Now, one thing that surprised me to learn when I did the research for this video is that Balerion does not have the red horns and other appointments that Drogon does. You might think about those two as being identical. Actually not. Drogon has a bunch of red appointments. Balerion is all black. Black scales, black wings, and of course, black flame that is shot through with red. Presumably he had burning red eyes, but yeah, no red horns, no red wing membranes. He's Balerion the Black Dread. Now, Balerion's black flame, it was said to be hot enough to fuse sand into glass, and I looked it up. That we're talking temperatures of 1700 degrees centigrade and over 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's absolutely ridiculous. Definitely hot enough to melt stone, which of course Balerion did at Harrenhal. Balerion's wings were said to be able to shadow entire towns when he flies between the sun and the earth, meaning when he creates a dragon eclipse. And Balerion's teeth, we know they're as big as swords. Arya saw them up close. Balerion's jaws, as you can see in this photographic evidence, are big enough to swallow a YouTuber whole. Oh wait, no, it says the jaws were big enough to swallow a woolly mammoth whole, which is much bigger than a YouTuber. As to the deeds of Balerion the Black Dread while he was ridden by Aegon the Conqueror, well, first, before the conquest, Aegon took Balerion over to Lys to defend it from a Volantene fleet, which was very successful. Balerion burned the fleet to to ash and cinder and floating flotsam and jetsam. And this was the time that Volantis got a little big for its britches and tried to essentially reform the Valyrian freehold. And so Tyrosh, Pentos, and Lys allied to stop the Volantines, and Aegon flew Balerion over for a little pre-conquest war practice. Shortly after, the conquest began with a few small local victories around the area of King's Landing, and then comes Harrenhal, the single biggest act of destruction that any dragon has ever committed ever, at least in Ice and Fire. Maybe Calagon the Black, let me know if he destroyed something bigger than Harrenhal. But yeah, Balerion and Aegon, they flew up till they were the size of a fly on the moon, and then flew straight down on the castle, melted the whole thing. The towers were melting and running like candle wax, and everyone in the castle basically was killed. The entire line of House Hoare was extinguished. And so do check out my produced Harrenhal video for the full dramatic reading of the burning of Harrenhal, which is about as metal as Ice and Fire gets. Then comes the Field of Fire, where Balerion and Meraxes and Vhagar came together on a flammable field to burn at least 4,000 soldiers of the Reach and the Westerlands, and in the process extinguishing House Gardener, the house founded by Garth the Green, which it's pretty sad, honestly. But it's very important for symbolism because Azor Ahai the Dragon took over the Weirwood Net, and anyway. Balerion also forged the Iron Throne. He melted all the swords with his fire to make the Iron Throne. So if it's ugly and lumpy and misshapen, you can blame Balerion the Black Dread, who's famously not a fan of symmetry. It's more of an impressionist thing. Anyway, next up we have the First Dornish War, where Balerion and Aegon burned several keeps. The keeps of House Will, Castle Skyreach, Sandstone, Vaith, the Hellholt. And then a few years later, after the tragic death of Meraxes at the Hellholt, we had the Years of the Dragon's Wrath. And that's basically Aegon and Balerion and Visenya and Vhagar burning every castle in Dorne over and over, again, for like 2 years, and that's every castle except for Sunspear, whom the Targaryens were trying to isolate from the rest of Dorne. Alright, so then after Aegon the Conqueror's death in 37 AC, Maegor the Cruel quickly claimed Balerion, whom he had basically been waiting for. And even before Maegor became king, so this is during the reign of King Aenys, Maegor used Balerion to put down a rebellion in the Vale. And then not too long after that, he got to fighting with Aenys, and Aenys had to exile Maegor. I think that was when he took his second wife. Don't quote me on that. But the point is, Maegor took Balerion with him in exile to Pentos. Then a couple years later, he comes back after Aenys dies and claims the crown, usurping his nephew Aegon the Uncrowned. But even before he dealt with Aegon, he basically accelerated the war with the Faith that was already going on during Aenys' reign. And there was that whole trial by combat thing. He's unconscious for 30 days, and once he wakes up, he goes and burns the Sept of Remembrance with hundreds of Faith militant and probably some Septas and Septons locked inside. So this is a war crime, but you can't blame Balerion. He's just doing what dragons do. It's Maegor, of course, who commits the war crime. Then we have this actually huge battle, which I sort of forgot about in the history. It's called the Battle at the Great Fork. It's between Maegor's forces, the royal forces of the crown, and the Faith militant. Each side brought 20,000 men to the battlefield, so a truly huge battle. And it does seem that Maegor and Balerion were the deciding factor. They burned many soldiers that day, so maybe one day we'll get more detail about that. And afterward, Balerion flew Maegor to the Westerlands to take out his wrath on some different houses that had allied with the Faith. And so we're talking about the seats of House Broom, House Doggett, House Falwell, House Myatt, House Lorch, and some others. Then he turned his attention to his nephew, Aegon the Uncrowned, who flew the dragon Quicksilver. And while the battle beneath the God's Eye was going on the ground, Balerion and Maegor met Aegon and Quicksilver in the sky, and it was a very one-sided battle. Balerion was 4 times bigger, and what we know is that Balerion bit one of Quicksilver's wings off, and that Quicksilver and Aegon then fell to their death. Maegor, of course, didn't remain king for very long. He reigned for 6 years, 6 months, and 6 days. The number of the beast. And so after Maegor's death in 48 AC, Balerion returned to Dragonstone. Not sure if that was his idea or the Dragon Keepers coaxed him, but that's where he went. It had been his home for about 150 years at that point. So then 6 years after Maegor's death, it's the story of Rhaea Targaryen, the unfortunate tale. A series of very unfortunate events. Rhaea Targaryen, of course, hopped on Balerion when she was, I think, 9 years old, maybe 11. And Rhaea and Balerion, they flew, Septon Barth thinks, to Valyria. And that does seem like the right answer since, of course, Araya came back with those horrible parasitic worms that seem to be related to fireworms, or maybe they are small fireworms. Hard to say. They're definitely creatures of heat. They cooked Araya from the inside, and they were killed when they were submerged in ice water by Septon Barth. Check out my Dracomorph video for just the horrifying truth of Araya Targaryen and the worms. And Balerion didn't come back unscathed either. He came back with a bunch of half-healed wounds, and in particular, there was a 9-foot rent down his left side. So it's one of those horrifying questions that George gives us. What could have injured Balerion the Black Dread at that point? Probably only another dragon, or maybe a fireworm, or some other monstrous mutant creature that lives in doomed Valyria that George wants us to conjure up in our imaginations. So let me know in the comments what you think injured Balerion the Black Dread, but it was something terrible. And although it is possible that the parasitic worms and something big enough to hurt Balerion could also have been found in Sithorios, Septon Barth thinks that Balerion flew instinctively back to the place of his birth, and that's why he would have flown to Valyria. So that's what I think happened too. And so after this, Balerion went to live in the Dragon Pit, and by 75 AC, so about 20 years later, the Dragon Keepers were telling Alyssa Targaryen that Balerion was too old to claim. Alyssa was looking for a dragon to claim, and the Dragon Keepers are like, no, we took Grandpa's car keys away a while ago. But that didn't stop King Viserys, who, very interestingly, in 93 AC claims Balerion the Black Dread, and at that point, you know, all he can do is fly Balerion around King's Landing 3 times. He was afraid to fly him to Dragonstone. He didn't think Balerion could make it. And indeed, Balerion dies a year later in 94 AC. All right, next up, Meraxes of the Silver Scales. And again, I just really do want to thank you guys for tuning into these longer videos. Most YouTubers are kind of chained to this idea that everything's got to be 15 minutes long. But because you guys have consistently supported my longer videos, I have gained this freedom to make these deep dives. I love doing it this way. So thank you very much again for joining me here in Plankytown Studios, which is today the House of the Dragon. I hope nothing bad happens. These planks do look flammable after all. But let's talk about Meraxes of the Silver Scales, who is a she-dragon and another dragon named after a god of old Valyria. And of course, god is a gender-neutral term. We don't even know really if the dragons have gender, besides the fact that some of them lay eggs, and there's the whole prince that was promised is really could be prince or princess thing. And so yeah, god, goddess, deity of old Valyria, you get the idea. And actually it occurred to me while I was editing that Meraxes the Silver Mirror Dragon is probably where the name Meraxes comes from. Mirror axes, with axes either suggesting body, again as in axe, thorax, but with a couple extra letters, or it could be reference to the cosmic axis. Either way, a mirror dragon like Meraxes, slain by a spear in the eye, is a pretty clear parallel to Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, who speared Urrax through the eye. And I would tell you that these stories are parallel because they are both essentially mimicking the comet through the moon eye, you know, calamity which caused the long night, and which George encodes in the symbolism of pretty much all the dragon fights. So even though we think about Vhagar as this huge dragon because she lived so long, Meraxes was actually older and larger than Vhagar at the time of the conquest. Not as big as Balerion, but bigger than Vhagar. So as the name suggests, Meraxes had silver scales and golden eyes. So low-key, actually one of the most beautiful Targaryen dragons. People talk about Sunfyre, but this is like a mirror dragon. That must have been absolutely insane to look at. Meraxes' birth is calculated to be before 88 BC because Tyrion tells us that the 3 dragon skulls of the Conqueror's dragons are the biggest 3 of the Targaryen dragon skulls. We know Vermithor was a large dragon who died at the age of 96, and so Meraxes must be, you know, probably at least that old or older. And that would put Meraxes' birth sometime before 88 BC, meaning in the first couple of decades after the Targaryens got to Dragonstone. So you see what I mean about she very well may have had one or more riders before Queen Rhaenys. In fact, it's almost certainly to be the case. It would be very strange if Meraxes was unridden for 50 years and then suddenly claimed by Rhaenys. Meraxes, unfortunately, is most famous for her death at the Hellholt. Very tragic, unless you're Dornish, in which case, hooray, it was a great victory. And the fatal wound was, of course, a scorpion bolt through the eye, so kind of like Urrax and Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, but this actually happened. Now, I've always wondered if there was some Rhoynish anti-dragon knowledge that made its way to Dorne. Of course, we know the Rhoynish immigrated to Dorne about 700 years before the present story. And the Rhoynish, of course, did take down 3 Valyrian dragons with scorpions in the battle right before the Valyrians brought 300 dragons to the field. So maybe, just maybe, there's some transmission of anti-dragon knowledge there. Another thing that we know about Meraxes is that Rhaenys loved to fly Meraxes. It was her favorite thing in the whole world. And we're told that Rhaenys flew Meraxes more than the other 2 Targaryens flew their dragons combined. Rhaenys occasionally spoke of flying Meraxes across the Sunset Sea just to see what was out there. So perhaps as a little girl, she had a Janara Bellaris Terrax poster on her wall. It definitely sounds like she might have been inspired by her. During the conquest, Meraxes, as we've already said, was present at the Field of Fire, and also for the intimidation of Torrhen Stark, who knelt to the Targaryens without a fight. And of course, there may have been Prince that was promised prophecy talk going on there. Check out my video, Why Torrhen Knelt. And so Meraxes' big solo battle during the conquest was called the Last Storm. That was when Rhaenys and Meraxes accompanied Orys Baratheon to take on Argilac, the last Storm King. It was also called the Last Storm because it was very rainy. It was so stormy and rainy that Meraxes was effectively grounded. But even grounded, she was still a problem. We're told that Meraxes slew many soldiers with claw, tail, jaws, and flame, including Argilac's vanguard and all his personal guard, leaving Argilac for Orys Baratheon. Rhaenys and Meraxes also flew to Sunspear to parley, meaning take insults from Merya Martell, the Yellow Toad of Dorne, who basically told the Targaryens to piss off. And then in 4 AC, we get the first Dornish War, which I already alluded to, and Meraxes goes down to Dorne with Balerion and Aegon, and they burn many towns, including Plankytown. Wait, Plankytown? This is fine. And then sometime shortly after Meraxes' death at the Hellholt in 10 AC, her skull was eventually returned to King's Landing. And so, rest in peace, Meraxes of the Silver Scales. All right, it's time to talk about Nana Vhagar. We know her, we love her. She doesn't love anyone. Her heart is full of hate. And of course, Vhagar is a she-dragon, another, like all the Conqueror's dragons, named after a god of old Valyria. And although Vhagar's appearance is never described in the books, George did tell recent calendar artist Sam Hogg that Vhagar is, quote, bronze with greenish-blue highlights and bright green eyes. And that essentially means that Dany's dragons are somewhat of a mirror of the Conqueror's dragons. Drogon, obviously similar to Balerion. Viserion is cream and gold, and Meraxes is silver and gold. And then Rhaegal is green scales with bronze appointments. And that's loosely a match for Vhagar, who is bronze with greenish-blue highlights and bright green eyes. So not exactly the same, but you can see the correlation. Hoary old Vhagar was 182 years old at the time of the dance. And if you remember, when Balerion was about 180, that's when the Dragon Keepers were like, hey, he's getting a little old to claim. So that's why House of the Dragon depicts Vhagar the way that they do. She really is getting up there, but again, when your heart is full of hate, you just keep hanging on and refuse to die. I don't know if you know anybody like that. In any case, 182 in 129 AC means that Vhagar was born in 52 BC, which fits with the idea that she was younger and smaller than Meraxes at the time of the conquest. However, by 129 AC, when the Dance of the Dragon started, she was said to have grown almost as large as Balerion the Black Dread. And of course, all of these dragon-sized estimates are made by little humans walking around on the ground and sort of eyeballing it. I don't think anyone's busting out a measuring tape, so take it all with a grain of salt. But Vhagar was super duper huge. And Vhagar really is the Queen of Destruction. That was the title of my Vhagar video from a couple years ago, which still holds up. And so here is the short version of Vhagar's many destructive deeds. During the conquest, Visenya used Vhagar to burn the Arryn fleet, reversing what would have been a great Targaryen loss. And after that, Visenya and Vhagar subdued Cracklaw Point, basically bloodlessly, without a fight. Then we had the Field of Fire, which I'm sure Vhagar had a great time at, and the submission of Torrhen Stark at the Trident. And then after that, Visenya and Vhagar, some more bloodless victories. She subdued the Eyrie, as well as the Three Sisters. And then we have those 2 years of the Dragon's Wrath following Meraxes' death in Dorne, where Vhagar and Balerion burned everything 3 times over. Vhagar lit the flames of Aegon's funeral pyre, and interestingly, it is said that black fire came out a darker shade of very dark gray, which is pretty cool. Or maybe no one thought to, wipe the soot off the sword. I don't know. But yeah, Vhagar sort of baked the sword even more, kind of like when you reheat the lasagna in the oven and forget about it. It just goes a little too long. The top gets all charred. Yeah, something like that. So then in 42 AC, immediately following the death of King Aenys, Visenya hopped on Vhagar, flew across the narrow sea to Pentos, and recalled her son, Maegor, and his dragon, Balerion, for a bit of rebellion and usurpation. We're not told that Vhagar was at the Battle of the Great Fork. However, Visenya and Vhagar did help prosecute the war against the Faith. They went to the Riverlands and burned the seats of houses Blaintree, Terrax, Deddings, Leicester, or Leicester, I don't know, you guys, you Brits tell me how to say it, and also House Wayne. And also, in a single night, Vhagar and Visenya burned all those places in a single night, just to show everyone how mad they were. Maegor and Visenya then threatened to burn the Starry Sept in Old Town, which, by the way, Visenya wanted to do all the way back during Aenys' reign when the Faith started making trouble. But then in 44 AC, Visenya dies, never having gotten to realize her dream of making Old Town a new Harrenhal, which honestly makes me a little sad. That she didn't get to do that. As much as I love Old Town in the High Tower, it was her dream and she never got to live it out. So after Visenya's death, again in 44 AC, Vhagar goes unclaimed for almost 30 years, until 73 AC when Prince Balin the Brave, second-born son of King Jaehaerys, claims Vhagar. 10 years after that, in 83 AC, we get the Fourth Dornish War, where King Jaehaerys on Vermithor, accompanied by his two eldest sons, Prince Aemon on Caraxes and Balin the Brave on Vhagar, they destroyed a Dornish fleet invading the Riverlands in a single day. So whatever we get on House of the Dragon next week, this is when I'm recording this, a week before Season 3 premieres, whatever we get from Jace and Baela and whoever else is at the Gullet will be a far cry from King Jaehaerys and Vermithor, Balin the Brave and Vhagar, Aemon and Caraxes burning the Dornish fleet to ash and cinders, again, in a single day. And then about 10 years after that, in 101 AC, Balin the Brave dies tragically. And also, somewhat suspiciously, check out my Grand Maester conspiracy video. And you may remember, even on House of the Dragon, King Viserys is sort of needling Otto about the suspicious death of his father, Balin the Brave. And yeah, that's Viserys and Daemon's father. Now, Vhagar did not have long to wait this time before her next rider, because sometime between 101 and 104 AC, Vhagar was claimed by Laena Velaryon, who was 12 at the time. This is a scene we did not get on the books, although artist Ertach Altanaz was kind enough to illustrate it for us. Laena, of course, was said to love dragon riding. She liked Meraxes. It was just like her favorite thing. And when Laena married Daemon 10 years later in 115 AC, they flew Vhagar and Caraxes to Pentos and the other free cities, much like we saw on the show. Very large crowds gathered to see the dragons, and it seems like they were just kind of having fun and living their best life. And of course, all of this is tragic and ironic since Vhagar and Caraxes end up killing each other at the Battle of the God's Eye, which we'll get to. But right now, they're friends and their riders are married. And so after Daemon and Laena are done with Essos and they go back to Driftmark, we are told that Daemon, Laena, and Rhaenyra on Syrax oft flew their dragons together in a sort of Targaryen throuple. And we're also told that Laena and Rhaenys were fond and more than fond of each other, so they really were flying their dragons together, letting their freak dragon flags fly, or their dragon tapestries fly. Anyway, you get the idea. So then 5 years later in 120 AC, Laena dies of complications related to childbirth, and it's a little different than on the show. Instead of her with her last breath crawling to Vhagar and having Vhagar immolate her, Book Laena is using her last strength to crawl to Vhagar to try to fly one last time. And then she expires before she can get there. So it's very tragic, a little bit different. But one thing that is the same is that Aemond One-Eye claims Vhagar at Laena's funeral. And there's also a similar fight between the boys that results in Aemond One-Eye losing his eye. And then, of course, 9 years after that, we know that Aemond and Vhagar were involved in the event that basically pushed the Dance of the Dragons War past the point of no return. And that was the killing of the dragon Arrax and his rider Lucerys at Storm's End. In the books, we're told that Arrax's head and Lucerys' body wash up on shore, which basically means that Vhagar chomped the neck, and then that was it. She was done. Then we get Rook's Rest, and that's kind of similar to the show version, except for it's not flat out said that there's any intent on Aemond's part to sabotage his brother. But the outcome is much the same. Aemond and Vhagar emerge unscathed. Meleys is trapped by the other two dragons and killed, along with her rider, Rhaenys, the queen who never was. And Sunfyre and Aegon are both badly burned and injured. But Vhagar Vhagar's cool. Again, her heart is full of hate, and she just does not die. Eventually, Aemond ends up flying Vhagar to Harrenhal, which is something we're about to see this season. And he's trying to provoke a fight with Daemon and Caraxes. But of course, Daemon and Caraxes gave Aemond the slip, or ran away in coward, depending on how you want to see it. But the point is, Aemond got to Harrenhal. There was no Caraxes, and so he took out his wrath. He waged a, quote, one-man war of revenge against everybody in the Riverlands, starting with all the strongs that he found at Harrenhal and also Lord Harroway's town. So there was a bit of mini-genocide. Aemond and Vhagar burned Harrenhal again, just to make sure it was all burned. And then he went on to burn Castle Derry, again, Lord Harroway's town, Lord's Mill, Black's Buckle, Claypool, shout out Primus and Les Claypool, Swinford, Spiderwood, until, quote, half the Riverlands seemed ablaze. Then Aemond and Vhagar ranged a little further afield. They burned Stony Head in the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon, Sweet Willow on the Green Fork, Sally Dance on the Red Fork, Bowshot Bridge, Old Ferry, Crone's Mill, and even the Mother House of the Faith at Bechester, or Bechester, Worcestershire sauce. Bechester. You got, again, English people, let me know if this is a real word. And as I alluded to, Vhagar dies in a legendary dragon fight with Caraxes and Daemon over the God's Eye. And as I always say, the most fascinating thing about this battle is how did they recover Vhagar's skull and Dark Sister, which was jammed into the eye socket of Aemond? I want to know if there's a medieval scuba unit using a bone saw down there in the lake water, or were they dredging the lake? Let me know in the comments, but somehow Vhagar's skull was recovered from the bottom of the lake. And that's, again, another just hole in the Targaryen history that I would love to have filled by George Martin. There you go. Now, as to Vhagar's name, I am very, very confident and also pleased to tell you that this is inspired by the star Vega, a blue-white giant in the constellation Lyra. Now, in the approximate era of 12,000 BC or so, Vega was actually the pole star. And in case you didn't know, the designation of the pole star wanders around. It shifts in a little circle because of the wobble of the Earth's axis. So every few thousand years or so, it's a different star that's designated as the pole star. Now it's Polaris. It used to be Vega. And this is all important because in A Song of Ice and Fire, the pole star is also a blue star, and it's said to be the eye of either the Ice Dragon constellation or the eye of the rider of the Ice Dragon. It all depends on how you connect the dots to draw the constellation, I suppose. And just to make all this symbolism crystal clear, George has Vhagar ridden by a dragon rider with a blue star eye, Aemond One Eye, who puts a blue star sapphire in his empty eye socket after it is put out. And so yes, Vhagar is a parallel to the Ice Dragon and named after Vega, the blue star, which essentially is the inspiration for George's pole star. There's actually a lot of mythical astronomy symbolism in the northern sky. I mentioned that Vega is a part of the constellation Lyra, the lyre, so that's basically Rhaegar's harp, and also part of Lyanna's name, Lyra, while the constellation Draco, the dragon, which coils around the polar axis and sometimes claims the pole star designation with its star Alpha Draconis, is part of where George is getting the idea that his Ice Dragon constellation should contain the pole star. Check out the unfortunately demonetized but still excellent livestream called Moons of Ice and Fire for a lot more on that. Next up, Targaryen Golden Era dragons, such as Caraxes. This is Daemon's personal coat of arms, so I guess that's Caraxes. Yeah, basically we're talking about the dragons of King Aenys and his children, Aegon the Uncrowned, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, and a few of Jaehaerys and Alysanne's kids, such as Prince Aemon, Prince Balon, and Princess Alyssa. And Daemon, of course, along with Viserys, are the children of Balon and Alyssa. So first up, we have Quicksilver, whose colors are not named, but presumably a silver dragon, a she-dragon, whose fireballs were described as being pale white. Quicksilver is our first Targaryen dragon not named after a Valyrian god. And potentially, I guess we should think that Quicksilver is the daughter of Meraxes, another silver dragon, but we have no idea if that's how it works. Anyway, Quicksilver was hatched in 7 AC, which is the same year that King Aenys was born. And although Aenys was a sickly baby at first, so the maesters say, Aenys quickly became stronger and less sickly after bonding with Quicksilver as an infant. By the time that Aenys took the throne as King Aenys the First Targaryen in 37 AC, Quicksilver would have been 30, which means kind of a medium-sized dragon. Unfortunately, Aenys, known for his timidity, he was afraid to use Quicksilver to put down the several rebellions and treasons that sprang up like weeds. And in large part due to that fact, Aenys had a short reign and died in 42 AC, with Quicksilver lighting Aenys' funeral pyre. As we've discussed, Maegor the Cruel immediately usurped Aenys' firstborn son, Aegon the Uncrowned, which is why he was uncrowned. But we can say that Aegon was a little braver, had a little more moxie than his father, because he and his sister Rhaena, who was already bonded to Dreamfyre at this time, well, when Maegor went to Old Town to deal with the Faith militant uprising, they snuck into King's Landing for their dragons. And this is actually when Aegon bonded with Quicksilver. So that's kind of brave, sneaking into the dragon pit and planning on claiming your father's dragon and then doing so. And then they escape successfully. Dreamfyre and Rhaena, Aegon and Quicksilver. And so then we come to that battle beneath the God's Eye, which we've already discussed. Quicksilver, even though 30 years old, only 1/4 of the size of Balerion, and so he was chopped. And that's it. Quicksilver's dead. And this was, of course, the first dragon-on-dragon killing in Westeros. So I guess now that I think about it, that rules out the idea of a Targaryen mini-civil war before the time of the conquest. But I didn't really think that was a strong possibility anyway. All right, so next up is Dreamfyre, whom we just mentioned. She's a pale blue she-dragon with silver markings, and she was just a hatchling in 32 AC when she bonded with a 9-year-old Rhaena, who was actually Aenys' eldest child, so a little bit older than Aegon the Uncrowned, her husband. Her brother husband. That means that Rhaena was probably the one to name Dreamfyre, which has always caused me to think that Rhaena was a dragon dreamer at a young age. And it was Rhaena, of course, who had the idea, which I think she probably got from a dragon dream, to place the dragon's eggs in the cradles of the other young Targaryens. And we are told that this invariably was successful and always led to a bonding between said infant and said dragon. Dreamfyre is one of only a couple of confirmed egg-laying dragons. For whatever reason, we're not often told which dragons laid eggs or which eggs or any of that. We don't know if it was Vhagar and Meraxes both laying eggs or just one of them, but there are several mentions of Dreamfyre laying eggs, so she might have been a more prolific egg-laying dragon than other dragons. Dreamfyre did not fight with Aenys and Quicksilver against Maegor and Balerion. At that time, she just was too small to even make a difference. And so after her husband was killed, Rhaena and Dreamfyre went to Fair Isle and hung out there from 43 to 47 AC. Fair Isle is the seat of House Farman, aka Alyssa Farman, you may remember her. But eventually, of course, Rhaena was recalled to King's Landing by Maegor because Maegor wanted to marry her. This was during Maegor's never-ending quest to produce some human children instead of the lizard babies that he kept having. But this was also right at the end of Maegor's reign. He died soon after this, and so in 48 AC, as Maegor was dying, bleeding out on the Iron Throne, Rhaena was using Dreamfyre to escape King's Landing with her daughter Araya and also the sword Blackfyre, which she seemingly stole right from under Maegor's nose, again, as he was dying. Then we have a second Fair Isle residency for the next couple of years, 49 and 50 AC, where Dreamfyre laid more eggs, but eventually they had to move on because there began to be fear of the dragons overrunning Fair Isle or whatever. And so they moved on to Casterly Rock, where the Lannisters quickly became desirous of one of those dragon's eggs. First, they implied that Rhaena should, maybe give them an egg as a rent payment, and then they offered to buy it straight out, at which point Rhaena decided to leave. And so Dreamfyre and Rhaena went to Dragonstone and lived there until the Alyssa Farman incident, where Alyssa stole 3 dragon's eggs from the Dragonstone hatcheries. We're not explicitly told that they are Dreamfyre's, but it's easy to think that they probably were. And these are the 3 dragon's eggs that eventually became Dany's dragon's eggs. So most people do think about Dreamfyre as being the mother of Dany's dragons, which may or may not be true, but I think it's a cool idea. Now, after Rhaena's husband, Andro Farman, killed a bunch of people on Dragonstone with poison, which ended with Andro Farman jumping out the window, his corpse ended up being fed to Dreamfyre by Rhaena. And this was in 54 AC, by the way. After that, Rhaena retired to Harrenhal, seeking out a castle to fit her mood, I suppose. And so she and Dreamfyre remained there until 73 AC when Rhaena died, which is 19 years. And then after that, Dreamfyre came to live in the Dragon Pit. So now we're going to jump forward in time almost 50 years to 120 AC. Apparently no one claimed Dreamfyre in all that time until 11-year-old Laena comes along and claims Dreamfyre, who is at that point 88. And this is one of the reasons why I think it makes sense for House of the Dragon to expand on Helena's story by saying flat out, yes, she is a dragon dreamer. If you look at what we know from the character in the books, it kind of seems like she might be that kind of person. And the fact that she claimed Dreamfyre after no one else had for 50 years kind of makes me think that she was another dragon dreamer, just like I think that Rhaena Targaryen was. That's all speculative, but one thing we know for sure is that flying Dreamfyre was Helena's greatest joy. So that's something we've heard a couple of times now. She was another one of those Targaryens that loved to fly, which is kind of mysterious why we've never seen show Laena flying Dreamfyre. Hopefully they'll remedy that in season 3. Hopefully. And so in the books, in 130 AC, in the second year of the dance, Laena takes her own life or was murdered at the Red Keep, and at the moment of her death, Dreamfyre, who's 98 by this time, supposedly roared and broke 2 of the 4 chains down in the Dragon Pit. So this is another proof of a strong psychic link between rider and dragon, and this was also important at the storming of the Dragon Pit because Dreamfyre, only being chained with 2 chains, shout out 2 chains, she was able to completely break free of her chains when the other 3 dragons in the pit were not. And because of this, Dreamfyre circled in the Dragon Pit and killed more people than the other 3 dragons combined. Eventually, one of Dreamfyre's eyes was nicked by a crossbow bolt, and so blind and bleeding and maddened by rage, she flies out of control into the ceiling and collapses the ceiling of the Dragon Pit on everyone and everything inside. And let's read a bit of the passage from Fire and Blood about the collapse of the Dragon Pit. The end came when a crossbow bolt nicked one of the dragon's eyes. Half blind and maddened by a dozen lesser wounds, Dreamfyre spread her wings and flew straight up at the great dome above in a last desperate attempt to break into the open sky. Already weakened by blasts of dragon flame, the dome cracked under the force of impact, and a moment later, half of it came tumbling down, crushing both dragon and dragon slayers under tons of broken stone and rubble. The storming of the Dragon Pit was done. 4 of the Targaryen dragons lay dead, though at hideous cost. And this is definitely mythical astronomy. This is just a larger-than-life symbolism of the moon cracking open to give birth to dragons, such as in the Carthian legend that Dany hears. The Dragon Pit is literally a dome made out of stone, just like the moon, and it's a dragon inside trying to hatch out of it. So that's always one of my favorite symbolisms. Obligatory moon meteors mug close-up. Shout out River Mist Fae. Oh yeah. Next, we have Vermithor, the Bronze Fury. He is obviously a bronze he-dragon with tan wing membranes, and he hatched from an egg placed in the cradle of Jaehaerys in 34 AC. This is only 2 years after a 9-year-old Rhaena bonds with a newly hatched Dreamfyre. So already by the age of 11, Rhaena is having this inspired idea to put the egg in the cradle of her younger brother Jaehaerys, and it works. And then it happens again a couple years later with Alysanne. Rhaena places Silverwing's egg in Alysanne's cradle, and it hatches and they bond. But getting back to Vermithor, we're not told that Vermithor is named after a Valyrian god. It does seem possible just because, I don't know, the name sounds pretty cool. But again, turning to the Ice and Fire wiki, it seems that Vermithor's name is almost certainly inspired by Vermithrax Pejorative, who is the dragon from the movie Dragon Slayer, which apparently George R.R. Martin loves. He calls Vermithrax the best dragon ever put on film, and the one with the coolest dragon name as well. And so it seems like George adapted Vermithrax into both Vermithor and Vermax. So I forgot to put this in the notes, but once Hard Hugh Hammer claims Vermithor, we have a very clear Thor's hammer reference. Vermithor, Hugh the Hammer, and thus Vermithor can be seen as depicting both sides of the Thor versus Jormungandr fight, because he's both a dragon and a Thor's hammer. And there's even a prophecy that runs around a Tumbleton. Hugh Hammer hears it and thinks it applies to him. It's probably about Robert and Rhaegar, and it says, "When the hammer shall fall upon the dragon, a new king shall rise." So Robert's hammer fell upon Rhaegar the dragon, and then Robert the new king rose. But of course, Robert is also a Thor parallel, slaying a dragon in a river. So this is more Thor versus Jormungandr stuff. So by the time of Maegor the Cruel's death in 48 AC, Jaehaerys and Vermithor are 14, and already at that point, Vermithor was said to be the third largest Targaryen dragon after Balerion and Vhagar. Jaehaerys and Alysanne flew their dragons to King's Landing upon Maegor's death to claim the throne, no doubt evoking gales of cheers from the public. And that same year, Jaehaerys and Alysanne also used their dragons to elope to Dragonstone because Alyssa Velaryon and Orys Baratheon, the regent and hand of the king, opposed their brother-sister marriage. But you just can't stand in the way of a couple of Targaryen siblings when they're in love. So they did marry, and then a couple years later, Jaehaerys took the throne properly at the age of 16. He did, however, kind of need to put Orys Baratheon in his place, which he did by having a little friendly chat with Orys in front of Vermithor, who he was feeding at the time. So Jaehaerys' style was basically walk softly and carry a big stick, with that big stick being Vermithor the Bronze Fury. And so what I mean by that is, for example, in 54 AC, Jaehaerys and Alysanne fly their dragons to Old Town to encourage the faith to choose a High Septon who was on board with Targaryen exceptionalism, meaning brother-sister incest marriage. And that worked. That worked. They selected the desired candidate. Interestingly, Vermithor and Silverwing stayed in the Red Keep and not in the Dragon Pit, perhaps because Jaehaerys always wanted to have his dragon close at hand. Jaehaerys and Alysanne flew their dragons north on a great progress, but we'll talk about that more in the Silverwing section because that mostly pertains to Alysanne and Silverwing. So in 61 AC, Vermithor finally gets some action when Jaehaerys joins Rhaegar Baratheon in the Third Dornish War, which is also known as the Vulture Hunt. And this was basically them putting down a rebellion by the so-called Vulture King in the Dornish Marches, who had been joined by Borys Baratheon, who was aggrieved at being passed over in the Baratheon line of succession. And actually, this is a super interesting example of the ways that Targaryens can use their dragons in battle. So for example, these rebels, they had a bunch of hidden encampments in the mountains, which normally would have been very hard to reach on foot, but Jaehaerys used Vermithor to fly through the mountains and find and burn basically all of their various hidden encampments. Jaehaerys also flew Vermithor over the battlefields and directed the forces on the ground in pursuit of the Dornish. Then Jaehaerys dismounted and slew Borys Baratheon in single combat with Blackfyre, basically to save Orys Baratheon from becoming a kinslayer. Then in 83 AC, we have that Fourth Dornish War, where Jaehaerys, riding Vermithor, accompanied by his sons Aemon, riding Caraxes, and Balon the Brave, riding Vhagar, burned the Dornish fleet, invading the Riverlands, along with some Myrish pirates and cell sails. And then 20 years later, in 103 AC, Jaehaerys dies, and Vermithor relocates to Dragonstone. And just by the way, George apparently has confirmed that that story that Jaehaerys told his grandkids about him and Vermithor defeating a vast host of wildlings and giants and wargs at the wall, apparently that's just a story. That's not something that happened. So one thing about Vermithor, he only accepts very handsome, good-looking riders. So the next rider of Vermithor is the people's champion, Hardhugh Hammer, whom House of the Dragon has actually made a grandson of Jaehaerys, which is cool. In the books, it's not specified. And this is, of course, at the Red Sowing. The show did a very cool version of this. It is a bit different in the books, but basically a bunch of Targaryen bastards line up to try to ride and claim the unclaimed dragons on Dragonstone. Vermithor is 95 at this time, and Hardhugh Hammer does successfully fight with Vermithor at the Gullet, at least in the book version, burning many ships. Then, of course, Hugh and Ulf the White, who claimed Silverwing, turned their cloaks on Team Black, on Rhaenyra's side, at the First Battle of Tumbleton, and participated in a vicious sacking of the city. Check out our Battles of Season 3 preview video if you haven't seen that already, which has a breakdown complete with marching murder rectangles of all the battles from Fire and Blood that will be adapted for Season 3 of House of the Dragon. So then at Second Tumbleton, Hugh Hammer was actually slain by bold John Roxton and his Valyrian steel sword Orphanmaker before Hugh could reach Vermithor. And so this resulted in a riderless and presumably pissed off Vermithor just sort of chilling on the battlefield. And eventually it says that 40 knights attempted to slay Vermithor while he was still waking up, and they all died. That didn't work. With the possible exception of Cannibal, whom we'll talk about in a second, Vermithor was the largest dragon alive at this time after Vhagar. So just a really dumb idea to try to slay the dragon with a sword at that point. And really all this did was piss off Vermithor, who then took to the sky, unleashed his Bronze Fury on basically everyone around, and he killed many lords and soldiers, including Lords Piper and Deadings, and also all their squires, servants, and sworn shields. Then Seasmoke hits the battlefield, ridden by Adam Velaryon, and he attacked Vermithor from above when Vermithor was only about 20 feet off the ground, and so the two dragons crashed to the ground and tumbled, and it seemed like Seasmoke was about to become a Vermithor snack, but then a riderless Tessarion jumps into the fray and attacks Vermithor, and Tessarion and Seasmoke had just been fighting moments before that. So it became a three-way dragon, not a dragon three-way, just a fight, a good old brawl of tooth and claw, and Vermithor ripped Seasmoke's head off. But as he tried to fly away with his prize, he was unable to lift off from the ground and actually succumb to his wounds. Silverwing, who we are told would oft coil at night with Vermithor at Tumbleton, and presumably elsewhere, they seem to have been a dragon couple, just like Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Well, Silverwing stops by at the end of the day and tries to lift Vermithor's wing with her little nose, but that, of course, does not work. And we'll talk more about what happened to Silverwing after that in the next section. But interestingly, we are told that Vermithor and Seasmoke's dragon skeletons remain a tourist attraction at the modern, rebuilt Tumbleton. So if you're ever near Tumbleton, make sure you see the dragon skeletons. And so that brings us to Silverwing, whom, as I mentioned, hatched from an egg placed in Alysanne's cradle by her older sister Laena, which gives both Alysanne and Silverwing a birth date of 36 AC. Birth date / hatch date. We've already mentioned some of the things that Alysanne and Silverwing did together, such as flying to King's Landing to claim the throne, or eloping to Dragonstone, very romantically. And when they stopped by Old Town to effect the High Septon election, Vermithor landed in the yard outside the Starry Sept. But Alysanne and Silverwing actually alighted atop the high tower and fanned up the beacon flame, which I'm sure was quite the sight, and which I am almost sure is foreshadowing for Euron calling Viserion, another pale dragon, to the top of the high tower. For more on that theory, check out the videos Secrets of the Glass Candle and How Euron Will Trick Victarion. But yeah, even without any foreshadowing or parallelism, that's just cool. And speaking of cool, the coolest stuff that Silverwing does is when they go on that royal progress to the cold north. Alysanne and Silverwing first visit White Harbor, the largest town. It's kind of a quasi-city in the north. And tens of thousands of Northmen, we are told, tens of thousands of people probably from both White Harbor and the surrounding area turn out to see the dragon. And also the queen, good Queen Alysanne. She's very popular. Then they fly on to Winterfell, where Alysanne gradually wins over the recalcitrant and truculent Lord Alaric Stark, aka Fly Alaric, who was at first wary of Silverwing and would not allow Silverwing inside the castle walls, but eventually softened and approached Silverwing and maybe had an affair with Alysanne, but that's a theory for another day. Then Alysanne and Silverwing flew to the wall, but first, on the way, they stopped at Queen's Crown, which was, of course, renamed Queen's Crown after Alysanne stopped there, and that's when they had the golden crown painted atop the tower, as well as the Last Hearth, and many other towns as well. Then at Castle Black, Alysanne noted that Silverwing does not like this wall, and this is, of course, when Alysanne tried to have Silverwing fly over the wall 3 times, with the dragon refusing each time. Alysanne wrote to Jaehaerys, who had not made it up there yet, and spoke of being concerned, because this was the only time that Silverwing ever refused her command. This is almost certainly a clue that Dany's dragons aren't going to be able to fly over the wall until it breaks or until its magic is broken, something like that. And then Alysanne and Silverwing, on the way home, they also visited Mole's Town, Torrhen Square, and even Barrowton. And I almost forgot, while they were at the wall, Alysanne and Silverwing also went to the Night Fort, and Alysanne actually sold her jewels in order to make the money to build a castle at Deep Lake and get the Night Fort shut down, which may have been a whole don't give any babies to the others prince that was promised type thing. Check out my longer video, Alysanne at the Wall, for all of these ideas. And so the only other thing we know about Silverwing and Alysanne is that during the second of their great quarrels, Alysanne flew Silverwing to Dragonstone. And this is when Alysanne is very old, and while they were there, she had her last flight ever on Silverwing. Then a few years later, in 100 AC, Alysanne dies and Silverwing returns to Dragonstone from King's Landing. That leads to the Red Sowing, 129 AC. Ulf the White, Ulf the Sot, claims Silverwing, who was said to be a more docile dragon at that point. Silverwing is not said to have killed anyone at the Red Sowing, although Mushroom does does potentially invent his own tale about having tried to claim Silverwing and gotten his arse roasted instead. Like Hugh the Hammer and Vermithor, Ulf and Silverwing fight successfully at the Gullet, where he promptly begins to get a big head about it, as does Hugh Hammer. Then we have the betrayal at Tumbleton, Hugh and Ulf turning cloak, sacking the town. Hugh Hammer actually declares himself king. Ulf, meanwhile, just drinks and debauches himself, and by the time of Second Tumbleton, Ulf the Sot, he slept through the entire battle because he had been so drunk apparently the night before. Then when he wakes up, he is the victim of the Caltrops plotting, and he is poisoned with poisoned wine before he can get to Silverwing. We've already mentioned the quote-unquote singer's story about Silverwing trying to revive Vermithor. I choose to believe that it's true. And in the aftermath of Second Tumbleton, Lord Unwind Peak offers 1,000 golden dragons to anyone who can claim Silverwing, who apparently was still chilling on the scene. And although I did call her docile, she's not that docile. She's still a dragon. The first man to try to claim Silverwing had his arm torn off, and the second was burned to death. And the third man, it says, changed his mind. So no one ever did claim Silverwing, and there's a little bit of a happy ending to this story. Silverwing goes on to have kind of a mellow retirement, making a lair for herself on a small island in the middle of nearby Red Lake in the Reach. At last, the Encyclopedia Draconica has come to Caraxes, the bloodworm. He's a red he-dragon who is named, obviously, for his blood-red color. And I mean this not only in the sense that he's called the bloodworm because blood is red, but also because of the prefix in Caraxes, car, as in carmine red. The word carmine and the word crimson, actually, comes from a Persian term, karmir, which means crimson. And that word is likely cognate with the Sanskrit kriminga from the older form krimi, which means insect produced because, of course, carmine red dye is often drawn from the shells of red insects. And that's from an older Sanskrit word, krimi, which means worm or insect. So bloodworm, it's kind of all right there. Red insect, red bloodworm, Caraxes. So a very well thought out and synergistic name and nickname. And Caraxes is one of only 2 red dragons in dragon history. It's Caraxes and Meleys, which is interesting because the Targaryen sigil, of course, is a red dragon on black. But when Aegon chose that sigil, he was riding a black dragon, and there were no red Targaryen dragons. So we don't know exactly when Caraxes hatched, but in 72 AC, we know that he was a young dragon of rideable size, and also the fiercest of the young dragons in the dragon pit. And that is the reason, we are told, that Prince Aemon, Jaehaerys' firstborn, claimed him. He said, "I'll take the fierce one." And so 11 years later, it's that 4th Dornish War. I think I've mentioned it 4 times by now, but you know, Jaehaerys and Vermithor, Balon the Brave and Vhagar, and Aemon and Caraxes, getting their first battle experience, burning that Dornish fleet in a day. Then in 92 AC, Aemon and Caraxes fly to Tarth to help Lord Cameron Tarth and Lord Bormund Baratheon put down an invasion of those bloody Myrish pirates, or at it again. They were successful in putting down the rebellion, but before they were, Prince Aemon, was killed by a crossbow bolt, essentially a crossbow sniper, and this was in between battles while Aemon was dismounted from his dragon, and Caraxes supposedly was eating goats at the time. But don't call him the throat goat. He was just eating goats down. Okay, I guess you can call him that. And this may actually have been a Maester conspiracy thing. Check out my Grand Maester conspiracy video, but they very easily could have hired some Myrish pirates, because it just doesn't seem like a freak accident that the prince of the realm is shot through the throat with a crossbow. And again, not in the middle of battle. Then it was, of course, Prince Aemon's nephew, Daemon Targaryen, who was the next to claim Caraxes. And we don't know exactly when this happened. We know that it happened by at least 105 AC, but Daemon would have been 24 at that time. So it seems to me likely that it would have happened, you know, at least a few years before that, based on the age at which Targaryens usually claim a dragon. However, it doesn't really seem like he has Caraxes in 101 AC. That's the year they call the Great Council. Daemon's older brother Viserys is one of the candidates. He eventually won, obviously. And Daemon marshaled an army and brought it to Harrenhal just to sort of, you know, intimidate the voters. But there's no mention of Caraxes. So either he hadn't bonded with Caraxes by then, or he just didn't bring him to Harrenhal, which seems off. I don't know. Either way, Daemon did have Caraxes by 105 AC, and in 106 AC, it's that war in the Stepstones. Daemon fights it with Caraxes alongside Corlys Velaryon and his fleet, and that war in the books actually lasts for 3 years. And so this is where Daemon and Caraxes become this experienced dragon rider team. Daemon, of course, declares himself the king of the narrow sea for a hot second, and the main point is just that Daemon and Caraxes were very successful. We already mentioned Daemon and Caraxes doing a lot of flying with Rhaenyra and Syrax, and Laena and Vhagar, as well as Daemon and Laena taking their dragons over to Pentos. And really the only major battle that Caraxes takes part in the Dance of the Dragons is the fight with Vhagar at the God's Eye. Caraxes' presence does allow Daemon to take Harrenhal bloodlessly, and the same sort of goes for the fall of King's Landing. But Caraxes actually doesn't get involved in any of the big battles. It does look like this will be different on the show, and I'm not opposed to that, seeing more Caraxes action, but it's really about this fight at the God's Eye. So Caraxes is about half the size of Vhagar here, but Daemon uses the trick of flying above Vhagar and then attacking with the sun at his back so that he's not seen until the last second. And we are told that Caraxes was able to fasten his jaws on Vhagar's throat and actually rip out Vhagar's throat, even while Vhagar was clawing open a big rent in Caraxes' belly and also tearing one of his wings, which means his arms completely off. Vhagar died instantly, she had her throat ripped out, but Caraxes managed to hit the lake and then crawl out of the lake to the lake shore before expiring. And so, long live Caraxes the Bloodworm. We will never see his like again. And now we come to our final Targaryen Golden Era dragon, Meleys the Red Queen. She is, of course, a red she-dragon with scarlet scales and pink wing membranes, copper horns and claws and crest. And she's described as splendid and magnificent, and she does sound very striking. I do love how the show gave Meleys the Red Queen a little bit of a little queen's crown of spikes around her head. I thought that was a nice touch. And Meleys seems to be approximately the same age as Caraxes. She's claimed in 75 AC from the Dragon Pit by Princess Alyssa Targaryen, sister of Prince Aemon and Balon. And although this is 3 years after Aemon claims Caraxes, we are told that by this time, by 75 AC, Meleys was already the fastest dragon in the land who easily outpaced Caraxes and Vhagar. So she must not have been like a 3-year-old at this point. But that's about all we can say. Caraxes and Meleys are approximately the same age. And then, like I said before, by 75 AC, the Dragon Keepers were telling Alyssa Targaryen that Balerion was too old. But Meleys the Red Queen really was not a bad second prize. Like I said, already the fastest dragon, and certainly a good-looking dragon. Now, as to the name Meleys, I think that George is effectively naming her after Melisandre, who is also called the Red Queen. Stannis' Red Queen, technically. And Melisandre, of course, has many dragon-like aspects. She's constantly burning people, and wants to wake a dragon super bad. Now, George did this, in my opinion, for reasons of deeper book symbolism having to do with Nissa and all this stuff that we really don't have time to talk about. But yeah, Melisandre, the Red Queen, Meleys, the Red Queen, it's definitely a parallel. And then so Princess Alyssa, she died in 84 AC after complications from childbirth. But before that, she did this really cool thing where she took a newborn Viserys and also Daemon within 2 weeks of their birth for a dragon ride on Meleys, and that's what you can see on the artwork here. And in general, Alyssa Targaryen is really just quite the character. So then in 87 AC, 3 years after Alyssa's death, Rhaenys, the queen who never was, who at that time was only 13 and just a princess, claims Meleys the Red Queen. And then 2 years later, in 89 AC, Rhaenys accompanies her grandfather, King Jaehaerys, on a royal progress, which is kind of a big deal. And 1 year later, in 90 AC, when Rhaenys wed Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, Rhaenys apparently insisted on making a grand entrance to the wedding on the back of Meleys. So that kind of tells you a little bit about the queen who never was. She was already a boss at like age 15 and 16. So in 129 AC, when the Dance of the Dragons breaks out, Meleys and also Caraxes are essentially around 60 years old, and they are kind of medium-large sized. Again, about half the size of Vhagar. And as on the show, in the books, Rhaenys and Meleys patrol the Gullet and back up Corlys Velaryon's blockade. She's the fastest dragon, so it kind of makes sense to use her to patrol. Then we come to Rook's Rest and the ambush, and before the dragons ambush her, Meleys and Rhaenys kill about 800 men. And then Aegon and Sunfyre appear, with Meleys closing her jaws around Sunfyre's neck, which, as we've seen, is usually a fatal blow if the biting dragon can hang on. But that's when Vhagar pounced from above, and then we had another dragon three-way, a dragon ball, hitting the ground together, and we're told that Meleys was essentially torn apart on the ground. Sunfyre obviously injured and burned, and damn old Nana Vhagar emerges unscathed. As on the show, the head of Meleys the Red Queen is carted through the streets of King's Landing. And as on the show, this is a bit of a bad omen. Thousands of people in King's Landing decide this was about the right time to leave the city. Because when the Dragon Lords are killing each other, you're going to get trampled underfoot. So yeah. All right, we're back on day 17 of filming for the Wild Dragons, beginning with the Cannibal, who I've made a video about. It's a whole big, you've probably seen it. And so the Cannibal was coal black with baleful green eyes. Shout out Aurion and also Shaggy Dog, who has that same coloring and description. Shaggy Dog ends up on an island of so-called cannibals on Skagos, but I've pondered this mystery for years, and I have really no idea what Martin is doing with that parallel. Cannibal probably has green fire or maybe black fire shot through with green, although we're only speculating because it's not said. And as we've already mentioned, it's unknown how old the Cannibal is or how long he or she has been living on Dragonstone. Cannibal is the biggest of the 3 wild dragons living on Dragonstone in 129 AC. That means bigger than Sheepstealer, and Sheepstealer, we know, hatched when Jaehaerys was young, so sometime in the late 30s or 40s AC. So Cannibal is even bigger than 80 to 90-year-old Sheepstealer, and thus huge. Now, I think that the claims by the small folk on Dragonstone that Cannibal predates the Targaryen presence on the island are in fact correct. We know that the Valyrians founded Dragonstone over 200 years before the Targaryens got there. And that means there were dragons on Dragonstone before the Targaryens, both to make the fused stone fortress and probably just to guard it. So Cannibal may be a holdover from that era, and he could even have been hatched from an egg that was left behind when the previous Valyrians left and the Targaryens showed up. And either way, it means that Cannibal could be as old or even older than Balerion. So over 200 years old. It's possible. The Cannibal is, of course, named for his or her habit of eating the young Targaryen dragons and the hatchlings and the dragon's eggs from the Dragonstone hatcheries. And in my opinion, this could well be a clue that Cannibal is from a different dragon lineage than the Targaryen dragons. So Cannibal is essentially trying to kill off its competition. And this is something that we obviously see in nature all the time. The dragon keepers on Dragonstone have made at least a dozen attempts to claim Cannibal, and Cannibal's lair is strewn with their bones. So none of those attempts were successful, and they stopped trying after a while. And nobody tried to claim Cannibal during the Red Sowing, because that was just an obviously bad idea. However, after Sheepstealer tore off the arm of would-be rider Silver Denny's, rest in peace, we shall never see his like again, the Cannibal descended. Drove off Sheepstealer, consumed Silver Denny's and his sons, so we shall never see their likes again either. And one wonders, does eating blood of the dragon people still count as cannibalism for the cannibal? Or were they just tasty snacks who happen to have silver hair? We don't know. But it is worth noting that this is in contrast to Sheepstealer, who eats sheep but not shepherds. So Cannibal is just vicious and hungry. Now, a very strange thing happened in 132 AC, so just a year or two after the war ended, at the funeral of Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake. He was buried at sea in the Velaryon custom, and supposedly the Cannibal flew over in salutation to Corlys the sea snake. It's a very odd little detail in Fire and Blood, and I for one suspect that this may also be a clue that Cannibal is a pre-Targaryen dragon, because of course the Velaryons were on Driftmark before the Targaryens got to Dragonstone. So they may have some connection to these pre-Targaryen Valyrians, and thus to Cannibal's dragon lineage. Again, check out the Cannibal video for the full story. And the last thing we know is that Cannibal disappears from the record after that. However, Fire and Blood ends pretty much right at that point. So when George writes Blood and Fire, which will have the second half of the pre-Daenerys Targaryen history, we could get more cannibal hijinks. George could garner in more cannibal action if he wanted to. And that brings us to Sheepstealer, whom we all have met the TV show version of now. I'm glad Sheepstealer mania is sweeping the nation. Very satisfying. Doesn't quite make up for Nettles. We're not here to talk about that, though. So Sheepstealer was a wild he-dragon living on Dragonstone, not in the Vale as on the show. Sheepstealer's on Dragonstone. And it's implied that Sheepstealer hatched from the Dragonstone hatcheries because the Dragon Keepers know when Sheepstealer hatched. Like I said, when the old king, Jaehaerys, was young. So that, again, makes Sheepstealer 80 or 90 at the time of the dance. And we know that eventually Sheepstealer took to living wild on Dragonstone and ranging far afield, actually. From the Wendwater to Driftmark, so basically all the lands adjoining Blackwater Bay. If you've got a herd of sheep, open and exposed, you're at risk of meeting the Sheepstealer, who, of course, is named for the fact that he don't mind stealing sheep. Sheepstealer's name in High Valyrian, which we heard Rhaena actually say on episode 1 of House of the Dragon season 3, is Bieladios. Bieladios. And that, of course, is according to David J. Peterson, the official language creator for the TV adaptations of A Song of Ice and Fire, who essentially invented the Dothraki and Valyrian languages. So Bieladios, that's Sheepstealer, who is described in the books as vicious and ill-tempered, and supposedly an ugly mud-brown color. And they really just kind of went to town with this on the TV show with the piebald spotting and the underbite, and it's really all terrific. But yes, Sheepstealer is supposed to be an ugly dragon. And even though Sheepstealer, like I said, not known for eating the shepherds, just the sheep, have no doubt, he was a vicious dragon, and he actually killed more would-be riders, more dragon seeds at the Red Sowing than all the other dragons combined. And then, of course, it was Nettles who befriended Sheepstealer by bringing him a fresh-caught sheep every morning until he grew accustomed to her presence. And eventually she was able to climb on Sheepstealer's back and form a dragon bond with Sheepstealer. And one of the reasons why I say that Nettles almost certainly did form a magical dragon bond with Sheepstealer is because Nettles flew Sheepstealer into the Battle of the Gullet pretty soon after claiming him. And I don't think that just making friends with a dragon would be enough to fly them into battle effectively. You really do need some of that psychic link of the dragon bond to communicate these things. And so I went into detail about why I think that Nettles definitely does have Valyrian blood and definitely did form the magical dragon bond with Sheepstealer in my big Where's Nettles video. I made that a couple years ago, basically saying why it wouldn't be good if they swapped Nettles out for Rhaena, but it's also just a video about everything we know about Sheepstealer and Nettles and the whole question of Nettles' dragon blood. So after the Gullet, Nettles was truly traumatized by going into battle. She returned shaken and stained with tears, and she never flew Sheepstealer into battle again. Nettles and Sheepstealer did accompany Daemon and Caraxes in the Riverlands for a time as they hunted for Vhagar, but then parted with Daemon and Caraxes before the big fight at the God's Eye. And that's where things get truly interesting, because, as most of you will know, this is where Nettles came to live in the Mountains of the Moon and was worshipped as a fire witch. And she pretty much started a new wildling clan called the Burned Men, which was a splinter off of the Painted Dogs, and that's the same clan that is led by Timett, son of Timett, in the main story. They're called the Burned Men because originally you had to brave the fires of the dragon in order to bring a gift to the witch to be in the clan. And in modern times, this has evolved into the custom of the men of the Burned Men clan needing to burn some body part in order to become a man, usually a finger or a nipple, but I'm not going to point. But Timett, son of Timett, he put out his eye with a hot knife. And everyone was so impressed, they made him clan chief. And yeah, that all started with Nettles and Sheepstealer. And technically, we don't know what happened to those two. Maybe we'll find out in Blood and Fire. But it's unlikely that Sheepstealer is still alive. He'd be 270 or 280, so that's pretty old. And that brings us to Grey Ghost, who is the smallest and almost certainly the youngest of the wild dragons at the time of the Red Sowing in 129 AC. Elusive and shy, Grey Ghost was a he-dragon, the color of pale morning mist, and Grey Ghost used his natural camouflage to fly low over the sea and hunt fish, which was his favorite food. Grey Ghost was never claimed or ridden by anyone. Too elusive. Can't catch him, can't see him. Just leave him alone. He just wants to catch fish. That's it. And I think one of the purposes of Grey Ghost in Fire and Blood is actually just to show us that if the Dragon Lords weren't making the dragons fight, they might just be flying around and catching fish and leaving people alone. So, yeah. At the Red Sowing, people did look for Grey Ghost to try to bond with him, but couldn't be found. But then towards the end of the war in 130 AC, Grey Ghost was apparently killed by Sunfyre when Sunfyre returned to Dragonstone after Rook's Rest. And actually, Grey Ghost was partially devoured by Sunfyre, who was healing up and needed the high nutrition meal. Sorry. And that means that Cannibal isn't the only cannibal dragon. Sunfyre is also a cannibal dragon. All right, on to the younger dragons of the dance, and we're going to cover a pretty broad range here, beginning with Syrax, the dragon of Queen Rhaenyra. Syrax, a bit of a throwback in that she is named after a Valyrian god, and also a Mortal Kombat character. Let's be real, Syrax wins. Now, Syrax is described as having yellow scales, just as Syrax for Mortal Kombat has a yellow outfit. I'm sorry, I'm not letting go of this. SYR is a Greek prefix and a variant of SYN, and it means together. So Syrax, it means approximately together body. And I would say that this could be a reference to the dragon bond. Three Heads has the dragon. You know, there's a dragon spirit inside the body, all that stuff. So in 104 AC, when Rhaenyra was 7, she bonded with Syrax, who was said to be a young dragon at that time. We don't know if Syrax's egg was placed in Rhaenyra's cradle or not. So Syrax is either the same age as Rhaenyra or just a couple of years younger. So by 129 AC, when the dance started, Syrax was said to be huge and formidable, though not quite as big as Caraxes. And I gotta say, it's a little frustrating that Syrax doesn't do more. She is a confirmed egg-laying dragon, and she laid the clutch from whence came Morning, the dragon of Rhaena Targaryen, son of Daemon and Laena Velaryon. That's actually the last named Targaryen dragon. And probably the coolest thing that Syrax does is when Rhaenyra feeds Syrax the body of Vaemond Velaryon after Daemon executes him, because he called Rhaenyra's kids strong bastards, and that was expressly forbidden, and so yes, fed to the dragon. Rhaenyra does fly on Syrax to take King's Landing, which we just saw on the show a couple weeks ago, and Syrax really doesn't do anything else until the storming of the dragon pit and the fatal, tragic flight of Joffrey Velaryon, Rhaenyra's youngest son, with Laenor/Harwin. And so you may remember, as the storming of the dragon pit was going down, Joffrey, who's like 13, he wants to do something. He wants to take some troops down there, and his mom just puts the kibosh on everything. So he actually tries to fly Syrax to the dragon pit, perhaps to reach his own dragon, Tyraxes. And it doesn't go well. We shall not pretend to any understanding of the bond between dragon and dragon rider. Wiser heads have pondered that mystery for centuries. We do know, however, that dragons are not horses, to be ridden by any man who throws a saddle on their back. Syrax was the queen's dragon. She had never known another rider, though Prince Joffrey was known to her by sight and scent, a familiar presence whose fumbling at her chains excited no alarm. The great yellow she-dragon wanted no part of him astride her. In his haste to be away before he could be stopped, the prince had vaulted onto Syrax without benefit of saddle or whip. Once in the air, Syrax twisted beneath him, fighting to be free of this unfamiliar rider. 200 feet above Flea Bottom, Prince Joffrey slid from the dragon's back and plunged to the earth. Syrax is then drawn to the violence and noise of the mob, and instead of flying away, she lands and starts killing lots of people, but is eventually killed herself. And there's a bunch of different rumors about how it happened. We don't know. But Syrax died amongst the mob and amongst the chaos of the storming of the dragon pit. Next, we have Seasmoke, a pale silver-gray dragon whose flames are probably blue. It's based on a passage where the flame colors of multiple dragons who are fighting are all described at once, so it's a bit unclear. But it does seem that Seasmoke's flames are probably pale blue. Seasmoke is obviously named for his color, and we should consider that he was named by Laenor Velaryon, who had a strong connection to the sea. This is another name that David J. Peterson has given us a High Valyrian translation for. So if you're feeling fancy, you can call Seasmoke Embrorbar, or however you want to pronounce that, but you can see it on the screen here. And in case you're wondering, I could only find 3 High Valyrian translations for common tongue dragon names, but do let me know in the comments if there are more that I didn't catch. So in 101 AC, the year of the Great Council, Seasmoke was a young dragon bonded to Laenor, who was 7 years old and actually had not ridden Seasmoke yet. So Seasmoke might have been too small, or Laenor might have been 7, you know, but that essentially means that Seasmoke was born probably just a few years before 101 AC. So I guess he should have been before Syrax, but oh well. Seasmoke was said to be Laenor's pride and joy, so apparently both Laenor and his sister Laena were both very natural dragon riders who loved to fly. And how not, really, how not? Now, one difference from the show is that in the books, Laenor does not fly Seasmoke in the War in the Stepstones. In the books, Laenor would only have been 11 when that happened. And so then in 120 AC, Laenor dies under suspicious circumstances, and Seasmoke goes unclaimed for the next 9 years until the dance. Then at the sowing of the dragon seeds, Adam of Hull claims Seasmoke. He's 15 years old at the time. And even though Adam is said to be Laenor's bastard son, it's pretty obvious that him and Alan are Corlys's bastard sons, which on the show they went with that with no ambiguity. And thus Adam would be Laenor's half-brother. And so whatever the family tree is, Adam is very closely related to Seasmoke's previous rider, which is often the case. Now, before Adam claimed him at the Red Sowing, Seasmoke did kill somebody. He killed Sir Steffan Darkland, one of Rhaenyra's Queensguard, who tried to claim him. And by this time, Seasmoke would be about 35 and thus kind of medium-sized, about the same class as Rhaenyra's Syrax. And Seasmoke is noted to be twice the size of Tessarion, who's like 10 or 15 during the dance, with Tessarion being 1/3 the size of Vermithor. So if you do your fraction charts, they're I don't know. It does seem that dragon growth starts out faster and then slows down over time like most animals. However, unlike most animals, dragons do keep growing forever, particularly when they are not confined. Adam of Hull, who eventually does take the name Adam Velaryon, he uses Seasmoke in the Battle of the Gullet, along with all the other dragons, quite successfully. And after Rhaenyra took King's Landing, most of the dragons were sent to various other battles, with Seasmoke, Syrax, and Teraxes judged suitable to defend the city. Seasmoke was housed in the Dragon Pit at this time, which will be important in just a second. So after Hugh and Ulf betrayed Rhaenyra at First Tumbleton, Rhaenyra becomes suspicious of Adam because he's a bastard too, and orders him arrested, even though he had done nothing wrong. And so Corlys the Sea Snake, he gets word to Adam, who's able to make it to the Dragon Pit, saddle up Seasmoke, and escape. Adam is a true hero, though. Corlys put one word on his tombstone, which was loyal, because Adam flees King's Landing, and then he flies to Tumbleton after gathering a new army from the Riverlands, and maybe, just maybe, stopping by the Isle of Faces. Then he falls on the greens at Tumbleton at night, and triggers a rout. Most devastating of all was the dragon. Seasmoke came swooping down again and yet again, breathing flame. 100 tents were soon afire, even the splendid silken pavilions of Sir Hobart Hightower, Lord Unwin Peak, and Prince Daeron himself. Nor was the town of Tumbleton reprieved. Those shops and homes and septs that had been spared the first time were engulfed in dragon flame. So the Team Green dragons here are Vermithor, Silverwing, and Daeron's Tessarion. However, Hugh the Hammer has been killed by this time. Ulf is drunk and passed out, and Daeron was in one of those tents that Seasmoke burned. So we have 3 riderless dragons when Adam and Seasmoke arrive. And it was riderless Tessarion who flew up to meet Seasmoke and Adam. This is that famous dragon fight that maybe looked more like a mating dance than a fight, and we'll actually read a bit of this in the Tessarion section. However, that's when some of the soldiers try to kill Vermithor, and Vermithor flies into a bronze fury and lays about killing lots of people. And so Adam and Seasmoke break away from Tessarion, fall on Vermithor's back when he's low to the ground. I already described this whole fight. They're rolling around and Tessarion dives on too. Seasmoke's new girlfriend, coming to help. And all 3 dragons eventually die. So it was an unsuccessful throuple. And go visit Seasmoke's bones along with Vermithor's bones. Don't miss the Seasmoke exhibit when you go to Tumbleton. All right, it's time for Sunfyre. Obviously, I had to put the jacket back on for Sunfyre. Give him some respect. It's the most beautiful dragon ever witnessed by a Team Green biased maester, perhaps. And Sunfyre is naturally named after his glorious coloring. Scales that shone like beaten gold in the sun with pink wing membranes, kind of like a sunrise. And George actually calls Sunfyre that dragon of the golden dawn. George does use Sunfyre for sun versus moon symbolism in the Sunfyre Moondancer fight. And let me know, by the way, if you'd like to see short videos reading and describing each individual dragon fight with a little bit of symbolism analysis mixed in. I was thinking about doing those for all the big dragon fights. But getting back to Sunfyre, we don't know when Sunfyre hatched exactly. He's of course bonded to Aegon II, the eldest son of Viserys and Alicent, and we know that Aegon claimed him by 120 AC, with Sunfyre being called a younger dragon at that time. Aegon himself was born in 107, so Sunfyre could have been hatched anywhere really between 107 and maybe like 116 AC. Probably towards the earlier end of that range, and judging by how big Sunfyre is in 129, he does seem to be a fast-growing dragon. So when Aegon was coronated, and this was missing from the show version, Aegon flew Sunfyre around the city 3 times and then brought Sunfyre down inside the Red Keep. So that must have been a hell of a sight, Then comes the Rook's Rest ambush, which also is different than on the show, in that Aemond and Aegon are conspiring together with their dragons Vhagar and Sunfyre to ambush Meleys. And as we discussed, Meleys initially closed her jaws on Sunfyre's neck, and then Vhagar fell from above. And it says, the dragons met violently 1,000 feet above the field of battle as balls of fire burst and blossomed, so bright that men swore later the sky was full of suns. And so, like on the show, Aegon and Sunfyre kind of take the worst of it. Neither one is killed, but they're both just horribly wounded, with the quote being, "And Sunfyre, that splendid golden beast, had one wing half torn from his body, whilst his royal rider had suffered broken ribs, a broken hip, and burns that covered half his body. His left arm was the worst. The dragon flame had burned so hot that the king's armor had melted into his flesh." And the reason why I read all that is not to be gratuitous. Sunfyre and the king have similar wounds. The king's left arm is burned, and Sunfyre, one of his wings, almost torn from his body. And Sunfire's not done taking wounds either. Sunfyre actually gets a ton of action. And so while Sunfyre was recovering from his wounds out there in the fields outside Rook's Rest, Lord Mouton retook the castle and sent soldiers out to try to slay the dragon. Slimy with mud, twisting amongst the bones of countless sheep, Sunfyre writhed and coiled like a serpent, his tail lashing, sending blasts of golden flame at his attackers as he struggled to fly. So Sunfyre killed 60 men, including Lord Mouton, and this reminds me a little bit of the last storm battle with Rhaenys and Meraxes. As you recall from earlier in the video, Meraxes was grounded by the rain, but was still a menace on the ground with tail and tooth and claw and dragon flame. So after that, Lord Mouton and his soldiers left Sunfyre alone. Again, 60 people were killed. And eventually, although no one saw it, Sunfyre's wing healed enough for Sunfyre to fly away. And it appears that, this is interesting, Sunfyre may have taken refuge in the pine woods and caves of Cracklaw Point, according to local tales. And so essentially what happened here is that Sunfyre's wing healed at a crooked angle and didn't work very well, and so he couldn't fly very far distances. And the description we're given is of a great golden fire-breathing chicken hopping and fluttering from hill to hill. Now, fortunately for Sunfyre, Dragonstone, not very far offshore from the Cracklaw Point Peninsula where Rook's Rest is located, and so he was able to fly to Dragonstone. The Maesters debate whether or not it was Sunfyre's instinct to return to home, or if it might have perhaps been Aegon's need that drew Sunfyre to him. And I think it was probably the second thing, considering that Drogon flies to Daenerys when Daenerys needs him twice in A Dance with Dragons. So at this point, Aegon is hiding out on Dragonstone in disguise, has not retaken the Citadel yet, and catches word of Sunfyre on the eastern side of the mountain, and so they go find him, and Aegon and Sunfyre essentially do rehab together in a little cave on the eastern side of Dragonstone, going for little flights every morning. And one of the ways that Aegon first heard about Sunfyre was because Sunfyre killed Grey Ghost on the way home, and there were sailors that witnessed the fight. So then when Aegon does take the castle, he takes Sunfyre up for a flight around. He's going to land inside the castle, but it's Moondancer. It's Baela and Moondancer trying to escape the castle, and they run smack into each other and have an epic dragon fight. Sunfire's already pretty beat up, took some fresh wounds from Grey Ghost, and so even though Moondancer is very tiny, it's a little more even because Sunfyre can barely fly. Moondancer flits around and gets a few wounds on him, and basically the dragons end up tangled in a ball, falling down to the Fewstone courtyard of Dragonstone, and on the ground, Sunfyre kills Moondancer. Sunfyre, however, at this point is basically dying. One of his eyes is now an empty hole crusted with black blood, and even though Sunfyre feeds on Moondancer's carcass, and also Rhaenyra's favorite maester, Gerardus, whose corpse Aegon fed Sunfyre, Sunfyre pretty soon stops eating and dies within, like a couple weeks. Oh yeah, and in between those things, Rhaenyra, of course, is fed to Sunfyre, who roasts her first and then eats her in 6 bites. Let me know if you want me to make a video about how big a problem it is for House of the Dragon that they chose to adapt this story, that's how it ends, and they've made Rhaenyra more sympathetic, and wow, yeah, this is going to be a mess, quite honestly. But that's what we know about Sunfyre, the glorious dragon of the Golden Dawn. All right, now it's time for the latest dragon we've seen killed off on House of the Dragon. It's Vermax. And as we said before, Vermax's name may be inspired by Vermithrax from Dragon Slayer, but I did find it interesting that the prefix ver, V-E-R, in Latin means truth, such as in verify. And bonding Vermax is how Jace proves or verifies that he is the blood of the dragon and a worthy heir to the Iron Throne. And then Verm, V-E-R-M, well, that's just a German accent on the word worm, wyrm. So Vermax could just mean wormy body, which could make sense. Maybe Vermax was fathered by Caraxes the bloodworm. And then finally on the name, Vermax is drawn as green in The Rise of the Dragon, where all the artwork was directed by George Martin. So perhaps we should think of the word verde, which means green in Spanish and Portuguese and other Romance languages.
No, Dave, not verde. Verde.
As to Vermax's age, we know that Vermax's egg was placed in the cradle of Prince Jacaerys, and he was born in 114 AC, so probably Vermax is the same age. He seems to be a pretty fast-growing dragon, and Jacaerys used Vermax to fly north to treat with the Lady of the Eyrie and the Lords of White Harbor and Winterfell, famously broing it up with Cregan Stark and signing the Pact of Ice and Fire between Rhaenyra and the Starks, and maybe having an affair with Sarah Snow, Cregan's bastard half-sister, and maybe Vermax laid an egg in the crypts for Jon to find. Check out Jon's Dragon Dream, where I connect Jon's recurring crypts dream with the idea that Vermax may have left an egg there. Pact of Ice and Fire, the prince that was promised, whose song was the Song of Ice and Fire, Jon's Dragon Dream, for that theory. So in the books, Jace and Vermax also die at the gullet. It's actually very similar to on the show, minus the crazy Sheepstealer thing. Vermax is flying low, and a grapnel from one of the ships tears a big rent in Vermax's body. The thing was tied to the mast of the ship, and Vermax's scream when this happens is heard as far away as Spicetown. So Vermax crashes into one of the ships, Jace is thrown into the water or leaps off, and then is shot with crossbow bolts. So in the end, it's pretty similar, and we will never see their like again. All right, on to Tessarion. This is a pretty interesting name. Tessara means fourth, as in Tesseract. Tesseract is a four-dimensional version of a cube, and Tessarion bonds with Daeron, who is the fourth-born child of Viserys and Alicent. So even though Sunfyre is called the most beautiful dragon ever, some people think it might have been Tessarion. Fire and Blood tells us that her wings were dark as cobalt, and her claws and crest and belly scales as bright as beaten copper. And if we're trying to figure out Tessarion's age, well, Daeron was born in 114 AC, the same year as Jace, and Jace and Daeron were actually milk brothers, so it's likely Tessarion is of a similar age and size as Vermax. As I mentioned before, we're also told that Tessarion is 1/3 the size of Vermithor, who's well over a century, and Daeron used Tessarion a few times, actually. He saved the Hightower army at the Battle of the Honeywine. And check out our Battles of Season 3 video for a breakdown of Honeywine and Tumbleton and all the rest. And what's cool is after Daeron and Tessarion saved the Hightower army at Tumbleton, they gave him credit and he was knighted, but he said the victory belongs to Tessarion. From there, Daeron and Tessarion scout and safeguard the advance of the Green Army. And because of the presence of the dragon, the Greens are able to force several lords of pretty big castles to submit without a fight. So they're making a big difference here. Daeron is only about 15, Tessarion about the same age, maybe younger, and yeah, they're making a big difference. So then comes Bitterbridge. Daeron flies Tessarion there to burn the town and commit some war crimes, frankly. And this was in response to other heinous crimes. This is the place where Daeron's little nephew, Aegon, and Helena's child, Maelor, was torn apart by a mob, and also Sir Rickard Thorne of the Kingsguard was murdered by the mob. And so Daeron took Tessarion over there and burned the town. Then Daeron used Tessarion to burn Tumbleton, along with the two betrayers, Ulf and Hugh, who were of course on Vermithor and Silverwing. And we're also told that Tessarion lays into the northern armies that were encamped outside the town walls. So it seems like we got to give a lot of credit to Daeron and Tessarion for being pretty effective in war, despite their young age. Then comes Second Tumbleton, and like I said, Daeron burned in the tent before he could get to Tessarion. And then we get the dance between Tessarion and Seasmoke, and let's go ahead and read a little bit of this passage. The Maesters are explaining dragon warfare here, and they tell us that dragon scales are pretty much impervious to fire after a certain age. And so, When two dragons meet in mortal combat, therefore, they will oft employ weapons other than their flame. And I just have to interrupt here. Mortal Kombat. See, I told you, George. Syrax, Mortal Kombat. Claws, black as iron, long as swords, and sharp as razors. Jaws, so powerful they can crunch through even a knight's steel plate. Tails, like whips, whose lashing blows have been known to smash wagons to splinters, break the spine of heavy destriers. And let me just cut in here real quick to say, damn, a dragon's tail knocking an armored knight 50 feet into the air, that sounds unpleasant. The battle between Tessarion and Seasmoke was different. History calls the struggle between King Aegon II and his half-sister Rhaenyra the Dance of the Dragons. But only at Tumbleton did the dragons ever truly dance. Tessarion and Seasmoke were younger dragons, nimbler in the air than their older kin. Time and time again they rushed one another, only to have one or the other veer away at the last instant. Soaring like eagles, stooping like hawks, they circled, snapping and roaring, spitting fire, but never closing. Once, the Blue Queen vanished into a bank of cloud, only to reappear an instant later, diving on Seasmoke from behind, to scorch his tail with a burst of cobalt flame. Meanwhile, Seasmoke rolled and banked and looped. One instant he would be below his foe, and suddenly he would twist in the sky and come around behind her. Higher and higher the two dragons flew as hundreds watched from the roofs of Tumbleton. One such said afterward that the flight of Tessarion and Seasmoke seemed more mating dance than battle. Perhaps it was. The dance ended when Vermithor rose roaring into the sky. So if you noticed a lot of dragons coming around behind one another there, yeah, they may have just been trying to mate. We'll never know for sure, but it is interesting that Tessarion dove back into that fight between Vermithor and Seasmoke. You know, maybe Tessarion was defending her new boyfriend. Maybe. It's really just hard to know. Dragons are chaotic. But now to the sad part. All three dragons died, of course, as we know, and Tessarion survived the longest of any of the three dragons, trying 3 times to fly, to take to the air, but eventually needing to be put out of her pain and misery. And so Lord Blackwood called upon his best archer, Billy Burley, who put 3 arrow shafts through the eye of Tessarion, the Blue Queen, from a safe distance of about 100 yards. Next up, Arrax, the dragon of young Lucerys Velaryon. Very memorable scene from House of the Dragon, of course. But before we talk about Arrax's death, let's talk about his life. Arrax's coloring is pretty striking. Pearlescent white with yellow flame, golden eyes, and a golden chest. So another just fabulous looking dragon here. And Lucerys was born in 115 AC, 1 year after Jace. So Arrax is probably just a smidge younger than Vermax. And so for Arrax's name, I looked it up, and the Latin prefix AR means towards or in the direction of, like arrow, arrive, or arrest. So that kind of makes sense as a name for a dragon. He's kind of like a golden arrow, if you will. And by 129 AC, Arrax was counted 1/5 the size of hoary old Vhagar, with Arrax's maximum age being 13. So when Jace and Vermax are sent north to treat with the Starks, etc., Luke and Arrax are sent on the shorter and safer mission to Storm's End to treat with Lord Baratheon, but unfortunately, Aemond and Vhagar are there already. Vhagar actually senses their presence first and lets loose a roar that shakes the foundations of Storm's End. And as on the show, it's in the middle of a terrible storm. Arrax is struggling to fly. They say that Arrax was actually faster and probably would have escaped if not for the storm, which was as black as Aemond's mood. And so yes, Vhagar chomp, as we mentioned, Arrax's head and neck washes up on the shore, along with Luke's body. And yeah, there's been a lot of good art of this, I will say that much. And I really did love how they did the scene on the show. Very exciting, very terrifying, very menacing. And so Arrax, rest in peace, we shall never see his like again. And that brings us to the majestic Tyraxes, who, yes, is a real looker, a purple dragon. I actually had forgotten that we had a purple dragon until I was doing the research for this video. And yes, the description, a pale violet dragon with dark purple horns and purple flames. And that makes it easy to figure out where George got the inspiration for the name Terraxes, as many of you will probably be figuring out right now. This is a reference to the Tyrian purple snail dye of the Phoenicians, which was associated with royalty in the ancient world. George has referenced this Tyrian purple snail dye in a few places. The Braavosi They get purple dye from the snails, but they don't use the word Tyrion. But then we do have Tyrosh, where everyone dyes their hair. And then we have the character Tyrion, who is secretly royalty. And remember, the purple dye, it's associated with royalty. And Tyrion he is at least half the son of Aerys. I think there might be a Chimera thing where Tywin and Aerys are both his father. Check out the 2 Tyrion Targaryen videos that I did. But yeah, his name might be also a clue about his secret royal heritage. And the Targaryens, of course, have purple eyes. So by 129 AC, Teraxes is big enough to fly long distances, but is judged too small to go into battle. And it's kind of a recurring bit in Fire and Blood. Little 13-year-old Joffrey, always wants to go into war and help out like his brothers, but Rhaenyra will never let him. He's too young. Teraxes is too small. However, Joffrey did fly Teraxes to the Vale to accompany Rhaena, who in the books goes to the Vale and doesn't find Sheepstealer. She just goes to the Vale. And similarly to the show, Lady Jane Arryn of the Vale, she wants a dragon to guard them in order to come over to Rhaenyra's side. And so they send Teraxes, and Joffrey flies there and then guards the Vale. Eventually, they come back to King's Landing, and unfortunately, Teraxes is in the dragon pit during the storming of the dragon pit and does die there, but he kills a lot of people first. So Teraxes retreats back into his lair and makes a pile of bodies that actually block the entrance. Unfortunately, there are back entrances to each individual lair, and the shepherd's mob eventually finds it, and they swarm in from the back, and Tyraxes, turning, tangles in his chains, which limits his movement and allows the shepherd's mob to kill him. Of course, there's different tales of who did it and how, but the horrifying thing is that some members of the shepherd's mob make themselves dragon skin cloaks from the purple wing membranes of Tyraxes, so that's kind of messed up. Alright, so I do apologize for being lazy and not changing my outfit. For every dragon, I just did the gold and the purple dragons, but it's time for Moondancer. And Moondancer, that's just a cool-ass fantasy name for a dragon, Moondancer, which in High Valyrian is Hjorlilio, or however you want to pronounce. I didn't look up the David J. Peterson pronunciation guide. I apologize, but you can see it on the screen. And Moondancer is a slender, pale green she-dragon with pearl horns, wing bones, and crest. So Jacaerys and Baela betrothed to each other, both with pale green dragons, even though they're fighting against Team Green. I don't know what to make of that. And of course, on the show, Moondancer got a pretty cool stylistic makeover. They gave Moondancer the tiger stripes and the David Bowie mohawk. Very, very cool. But it should be noted that Moondancer is smaller and younger in the books. By the time of the dance, Moondancer is only horse-sized and is similarly judged not big enough to fight, and not even just borderline not big enough to carry a rider. Now, as the war progresses, Baela begins to take Moondancer on flights a few months before Aegon arrives to Dragonstone, and Baela escapes with Moondancer but gets into the fight with Sunfyre. And as I alluded to earlier, there is some very cool sun and moon symbolism during that fight that recalls the language of the Carthene origin of dragons myth, which speaks of the moon wandering too close to the sun and cracking from the heat. And Moondancer, similarly, wanders too close to Sunfyre and is blinded by a huge furnace blast of golden flame. However, Moondancer flies on and slams into Sunfyre and takes a bunch of chunks, a bunch of bites out of Sunfyre's neck. And so as they're falling, Moondancer is trying to break free but can't. They both slam into the ground. I already said this. Basically, Sunfyre kills Moondancer on the ground and feeds on Moondancer's corpse. However, Sunfyre does succumb to his wounds shortly after, so Moondancer at least does earn a draw in that fight. And we're back with some fresh candles because it was time to talk about the toddler dragons, the little baby dragons and toddler dragons and miscellaneous dragons at the end of the Targaryen dragon era. And we will begin with Stormcloud, brave, heroic Stormcloud, the dragon of Prince Aegon the Younger, the eldest son of Rhaenyra and Daemon, who does eventually go on to become King Aegon Targaryen III, known as the Dragon's Bane, which we'll explain in a moment. And so Stormcloud was a turquoise dragon with black horns and other appointments, another very good-looking dragon. And by 129 AC, when the dance began, Aegon was 9. Aegon the Younger was only 9 and had not mounted Stormcloud yet. It does say that the egg was placed in the cradle of Aegon the Younger, but it must not have hatched, right when he was born, because otherwise the dragon would be 9 and plenty big enough to ride. But it says that basically in 129 AC, again, when Aegon was 9, Stormcloud was just barely big enough for Aegon to fly. And as you may know, Stormcloud's first flight was his only flight. And this is that incident during the dance when Rhaenyra packs Aegon the Younger and his younger brother Viserys on the cog called the Gay Abandon and sent them over to Pentos for safekeeping. But what had happened was they were intercepted by some Triarchy pirates and taken captive, except for that Aegon was able to mount Stormcloud and make a desperate escape. And so, clinging to the neck of his dragon, which was wounded by several arrows, Aegon does manage to escape. Stormcloud, again, bravely and heroically carries Aegon to Dragonstone and saves Aegon's life, but then expires shortly after from all the arrow wounds. So, brave Stormcloud, brave, heroic Stormcloud. He flapped for all he could and got Aegon safely home with the very last bits of his strength. So we always have to have a special spot in our heart for Stormcloud. Now, Aegon apparently was a bit traumatized by this experience. He would never ride another dragon and came to be called the Dragonsbane, both because the last dragons died during his reign and because he was honestly terrified of dragons. And basically, we're just talking about Rhaena's mourning. A very young pink dragon, and Aegon he's terrified. It's like, get it out of my sight. So yeah, the Dragonsbane. Kind of ungrateful, really, when you think about everything that Stormcloud did for him, and then he just turned his back on the very idea of Targaryen dragons, but alas. All right, let's talk about the dragons Shrykos and Morghul at the same time. I know, very cool names. These are the dragons of the twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, the children of Aegon II and Helaena. They were never ridden, and they die in the storming of the dragon pit. But they do kill a bunch of people before that. And we don't actually know how big they are. They could be as old as 6, the same age as the twins, which means they could be as big or bigger than Drogon at Daznak's pit, where his wings are 20 feet in spread. And I point this out because, again, Shrykos and Morghul killed a bunch of people at the storming of the dragon pit. So these were not like, dog-sized dragons with wings. They were big enough to kill a lot of people. And so Shrykos, again, a very cool name. This is a she-dragon, a copper-colored she-dragon, seemingly named after a shrike, which is a very famous bird of prey. A very fast bird of prey. And then Morghul, of course, is black in color and obviously named after the Morgul Vale and Minas Morgul from Lord of the Rings. And so in Sindarin, which is one of the Elvish languages in the Lord of the Rings universe, Morghul means black sorcery. It's a combination of the words morn, which means black, and ghoul, which means magic. So black magic or black sorcery. And George seems to have borrowed this word in Valyrian because, of course, Valar Morghulis means all men shall die, with Morghulis meaning die or death. Now, Shrykos and Morghul could very easily be names of Valyrian gods. I'd guess so if I had to bet, especially since Morghulis means death or die in Valyrian. So perhaps Morghul is the Valyrian god of death. New theory, hashtag new theory. And in fact, because Tolkien's gods are called the Valar, Valar Morghulis translated in Sindarin would mean the gods of black magic. And so yeah, maybe Morghul is the Valyrian god of death and black magic. And so, discussing their deaths at the dragon pit, Shrykos was said to have killed scores of people. So 40, 60, that's a lot of people. But unfortunately, Shrykos was killed by someone named Hob the Hewer, who leapt upon her back and struck 7 blows with his axe, calling out the names of the gods of the 7, this is a little bit mythicized, as you can see. But Shrykos seemingly did die, had her head chopped off, and Morghul, also said to have killed scores of people with his Dragonfyre, was slain by someone called the Burning Knight, who speared the dragon through the eye even as he was roasted in Dragonfyre. So it kind of sounds like there's some Long Night stuff there. A black dragon named Morghul, a burning man like a Firewhite, attacking a dragon whose name means death or black magic. Kind of sounds like Firewhite John, battling against the Night King, maybe an ice dragon, who knows. And now it's time for Mourning, the last named dragon of House Targaryen. And once again, I will say the last Targaryen dragon being named Mourning is probably even more Long Night stuff. Mourning hatches from an egg given to Rhaena, the younger sister of Baela, and of course they're the daughters of Daemon Targaryen and Laena Velaryon. And Mourning's hatching is actually very important. She hatches later in the war after basically all the other dragons are dead and give gives hope to Team Black. At that point, this is the only Targaryen-bonded dragon under control. The only other surviving dragons have gone wild. So even though Morning is just a baby and clearly not of fighting age, it's a very important political symbol and also just a symbol about the future and Team Black's ability to continue in the tradition of Targaryen dragon riding. As you can see, Morning was a pale pink dragon with black horns and appointments. And to be exact, she hatched at the very end of 130 AC, and by 135 AC, Rhaena was riding her. Now before that, Rhaena could be seen often around King's Landing with Morning wrapped around her shoulders like a stole. So very fashionable, the last Targaryen dragon. You know, Dany does that a lot, with Viserion in particular. And also interesting trivia, Morning makes her lair in the ruins of the Dragon Pit, all by her lonesome. So that's kind of metal, post-apocalyptic dragon roosting. And as to how big Morning got and how long Morning lived, we actually don't know. We only know that in 153 AC, a dragon that was not Morning was the last dragon, quote unquote, an unnamed dragon that died in King's Landing in 153 AC. So Morning must have been dead by that time, which means she could have gotten as old as 20 and change or so. But we'll have to wait for George to write Blood and Fire and tell us exactly what happened there. Rhaena marries a Corbray right after the war, and we know that she still had her dragon at that time, although Rhaena seems to have been living on Dragonstone and not in the Vale. And then not too long after that, sadly, her Corbray husband dies and she marries a Hightower and has 6 kids by him. So it's even possible that Morning came to live at Old Town for a time, which would be quite the sight. But again, we'll have to wait for George to write that. We do not know for sure. And then as to that last dragon that died in 153 AC, this is the dragon that Sir Arlen of Pennytree actually saw in King's Landing in 152 AC, just a year before she died. We have to assume that she did have a name, we're just not given it, but yeah, it was a she-dragon, a small and stunted green she-dragon with withered wings, quote-unquote, it's very sad. And she did lay a clutch of 5 dragon's eggs, which never hatched, also very sad. Marwyn the Mage certainly does imply that the Maesters killed off the dragons and may have poisoned the dragons, so perhaps this deformity, these withered wings, is a symptom of that. But it could also easily be something more mystical that we don't quite understand and could theorize about. Tyrion did see all the Targaryen dragon skulls in the chambers beneath King's Landing when he was there, and he noted that the last 2 dragon skulls were small, about the size of a mastiff's skull, and that they were slightly twisted and deformed. So one of those skulls was probably Morning. And finally, many people do say and think that magic started going out of the world after this last dragon died. All right, kind of an honorable mention here. It's Laena Velaryon II's wyrm-dragon. This is Laena Velaryon, the granddaughter of the Laena who married Daemon. She's the daughter of Alan Oakenfist and Baela Targaryen. And so this Laena II, she was born in 134 AC, just a couple of years after the dance ended, and her cradle dragon hatched just a year later in 135 AC, so Laena still would have been a little baby at this time. And surprise, it's not a dragon. It's a wingless worm, blind and maggot white, and it immediately, upon hatching, attacks Laena and bites a chunk out of her arm before Lord Alan Oakenfist can react quickly and chop the thing to pieces. And so if that all sounds a little bit like something out of the movie Aliens, or one of their many, many sequels, all of which are pretty good actually. Well, not the Alien vs. Predator movies, but the Prometheus and Alien Covenant, those I'm a fan. And the point is, I do think that George was inspired by the Aliens movies, both with this aggressive Laena wyrm-dragon incident and also with Princess Area's parasitic worms that she and Balerion got in Valyria. And basically, these scenes are not only inspired by the Aliens movies, but actually a clue that George has borrowed some sort of xenomorph DNA transformative properties from the xenomorphs and given them to some of his worm creatures. And that this is in fact how the Valerians crossbred worms and wyverns to make dragons, how the blood of the dragon people were created, and basically it's a super twisted theory. One of my best. Check out the Dracomorph video. It's a wormy good time. A wormy good time. Now, curiously, 146 years after the last Targaryen dragon died, and 16 years after the fall of the Targaryen dynasty, Daenerys Targaryen hatches 3 dragon's eggs out on the Dothraki Sea. This would be 299 AC, and she names her dragons Viserion, Rhaegal, and Drogon, and becomes the first person to hatch dragon's eggs again in some 150 years or more. You may remember some of this from the story. It's a bit of a highlight. Alright, first we have Viserion. Viserion was the first dragon to hatch. And Viserion is of course named after Viserys Targaryen, Dany's brother. We don't know if Viserion is a he-dragon or a she-dragon. I'm just going to say he for the sake of convenience, but do not take that as any sort of canon. We do not know. Viserion could start laying eggs anytime, who knows? But named after Viserys, so I'll call him he. And Viserion has pale cream scales, but also is just called the white dragon quite often. So a pale dragon, cream or white, but with gold horns and appointments, the spinal crest, the wing bones, and eyes like pools of molten gold. That means Viserion effectively has a golden crown, just like Viserys got the golden crown, so to speak, from Drogo. But like all dragons, Viserion still does have black teeth and claws. Viserion breathes pale gold flame, shot through with red and orange. And we should note that Dany looks sick as fuck when she wears the white lion pelt with Viserion coiled around her neck and rides her silver mare. I'm sure that is a stunning figure to cut. Viserion gets his first kill when he's unchained against the wise masters of Astapor. And Viserion at this time is basically the size of a dog with wings. Viserion is the one in that very cool Dany scene atop the pyramid of Meereen. Viserion is coiled around the pear tree in the garden and puts his tail in his mouth to literally make a dragon Ouroboros. Viserion thumps the tree to knock a pear loose. He senses Dany's disquiet, and Dany asks Viserion if he and Drogon have been fighting again, which is some sort of yin-yang ice and fire symbolism. Or maybe Drogon and Viserys' spirits, some part of them are in the dragons and, you know, they don't like each other still. When Dany wants to chain her dragons under the Great Pyramid of Meereen, Viserion is chained by Dany herself. Dany leads him there and feeds him a bunch of oxen until he grows drowsy, and he's kind of easy to chain up, honestly. Although later he does snap one chain and melt the others to free himself down in the pit, and he's the one that carves the little lair, the little cave up high in the brick wall. And then he hangs upside down like some huge white bat. So when Quentyn breaks in to try to steal the dragons, Viserion is the one who is shot at by one of the crossbowmen and then gets really mad and comes into the hall and kills a bunch of people. Quentyn then tries to tame Viserion with the whip, but, you know, look behind you, bro. It's Rhaegal. Surprise, it's Rhaegal. Then after Viserion and Rhaegal escape and make their lairs in various pyramids, Viserion makes his lair in the pyramid of Ulhez, which reminds me of Ulf the White, since we have Viserion the White, pyramid of Ulhez, and Ulf the White riding a silver, meaning a pale dragon. And Ulf, of course, means wolf. So this may be also about Jon Snow, the White Wolf, who eventually will be a dragon rider. But we don't have time to spiral out into symbolism. I just thought I'd point out the parallel there. And then Viserion, he was last seen eating some of the catapulted plague corpses out of the air above Meereen. And don't worry, he's cooking them first, so I'm sure it's fine. All right, next we have Rhaegal, hatched second and obviously named after Rhaegar, Dany's brother, who died on the green banks of the Trident, and Rhaegal is the green dragon. And also shout out to Rhaegal, the brother, the simple-minded but sweet brother of Baelor Breakspear and Maekar Targaryen. As to George's inspiration for the name Rhaegal, it could be a reference to the Greek Rhea, the sister wife of Cronus, who, after Cronus ate a bunch of their divine children, eventually hides Zeus away to keep him safe from Cronus, kind of like Jon and Dany were hidden away from Robert, and kind of like Luke and Leia were hidden away from Darth Vader. It's a trope. And I mention this, of course, because Rhaegal, it would make sense if that became Jon's dragon. Rhaegal's coloring in particular seems appropriate. Dark jade green with bronze horns and appointments. So maybe bronze for the first men, and green for Jon's green magic, his green seer-derived skin changer magic. And Rhaegal is also named after Jon's dad, Rhaegar, so who knows? I do, of course, have Viserion pegged as the dragon that Euron is going to try to steal. And check out Euron's plan to trick Viserion theory video for more on that. But getting back to Rhaegal, the green dragon, his flame is yellow and orange, but it is shot through with green. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And just like Viserion, Rhaegal gets his first fighting action against the wise masters of Astapor. In A Dance with Dragons, Sir Barristan in Meereen says that Rhaegal has proven to be the more dangerous dragon than Viserion so far. And we do see that when they attempt to confine the dragons. Rhaegal is much harder to confine than Viserion. It takes 3 attempts and he burns 6 men in the process. Then he grows wilder in captivity, leading up to his fatal roasting of Quentyn Martell, the Dragon Tamer, which again comes with Rhaegal sneaking up from behind, or you could say to help out his brother Viserion and save him from this Dornish man's whip. So then after the dragons are freed, Rhaegal makes his lair in the crumbling pyramid of Hascar, killing many slavers, but then it crumbles and collapses all the way. So he has to relocate to the pyramid of Yerzan. If you're trying to look up Rhaegal in Meereen, he's in the pyramid of Yerzan. And at last we've come to Drogon. Drogon, the last of Dany's dragons to hatch, obviously named for Khal Drogo. And even though Drogon is named after Drogo, naming your dragon Drogon is kind of like naming your dog Doggy. But I mean, it does still work. Dany's handmaidens call Drogon Balerion the Black Dread come again. And he does have a cool nickname like Balerion, Drogon the Winged Shadow. As we've discussed already, Drogon, unlike Balerion, has the red horns and spinal crests and wing membranes. And in fact, Drogon's black scales, when you look it up, they're actually streaked with scarlet red. Drogon and Balerion apparently breathe the same black fire shot through with red or red and gold. And Drogon, who has always been bigger than Rhaegal and Viserion, has now grown much larger than them because he has been living in the wild where they have been confined. By the time of Daznak's pit, Drogon's wings are 20 feet tip to tip, and he seems to have approximately a horse-sized body. Drogon does also seem to be the most vicious of Dany's dragons, and Drogon gets his first kill before the other dragons. Dany, of course, you may remember, brings Drogon into the House of the Undying, and it is Drogon who roasts them, sets them all on fire, and when Dany comes out, she says, the victory belongs to Drogon. Then at Astapor, Drogon initiates the fight by killing the detestable Krasnys Monaclaws. He essentially burned his face off, and I'm sure he killed many other slave masters besides. Drogon is the one who sets the Yunkish envoy, I think it's Grazdan's Tokar, on fire in a humorous scene, which I'm sure you will remember. And then in Meereen, when Dany is trying to confine her dragons, Drogon is having none of it. 3 attempts are made, and that ends in 4 deaths and many burned people. And Drogon flying off to the Dothraki Sea to make his home on that cool little rock, which Dany eventually renames Dragonstone. So yeah, Drogon, he takes to living wild, hunting sheep, and maybe that one girl, Hosea. Although that could be propaganda, we really don't know. We do know that Drogon descends from the sky at Daznak's pit, in response to Dany's need, killing the boar that killed Barsenna, and then eating the boar and Barsenna at once. Some dude named Hargaz the Hero manages to successfully spear Drogon, which causes Dany and Drogon to scream at once, but then Drogon tears his arm off and kills him, and then goes on to set most of Daznak's pit on fire, causing a stampede and many more deaths. Drogon then flies Dany out to the new Dragonstone rock in the Dothraki Sea, and then of course when Dany leaves and tries to make her way back to Meereen and is confronted by Khal Draco and his hostile Khalasar, Drogon again responds to Dany's need, once more descends from the sky, and that's where we left off all those years ago. But whenever we do get Winds of Winter, one of the first things we will see may be Drogon burning people, or Dany and Drogon on the way to the Mother of Mountains, where, in my opinion, they will collectively become the stallion that mounts the world and fulfill prophecy and reorder Dothraki tradition and all kinds of things. So Drogon has many deeds left to add to his tally, as do Rhaegal and Viserion. And so stay tuned for the exciting conclusion of A Song of Ice and Fire, and maybe the appearance of the Ice Dragon. Anyway, this has been the Dragon Encyclopedia. Thank you very much for watching. If you're still watching all the way to the end, please do make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Leave a comment, hit the thumbs up, rave about it to your significant other who's only, just so interested in Ice and Fire. You gotta watch this one video. I'm telling you. Anyways, thank you guys. I'll see you next time. And of course, every Sunday after House of the Dragon.